The story of the Ottoman Empire began in the late 13th century when a small frontier principality emerged in northwestern Anatolia. At first, few could have imagined that this modest beylik would one day dominate 3 continents. Like many other Turkic leaders of the period, Osman, the dynasty's founder, descended from nomadic Turkoman tribes whose ancestors had migrated westward from Central Asia in search of new lands and opportunities. The movement of these Turkic tribes into Anatolia had begun long before Osman's rise. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks achieved a decisive victory over the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, opening the interior of Anatolia to large-scale Turkoman settlement. Over the following decades, countless tribes established themselves across the region. A branch of the Seljuk dynasty eventually founded the Sultanate of Rum, ruling from Konya. Local tribal leaders accepted Seljuk authority, providing military support and paying tribute while maintaining considerable independence within their own territories. This political landscape changed dramatically after 1243 when the Mongols crushed the Seljuk army at the Battle of Köse Dağ. The once powerful Seljuk state fell under Mongol domination, while local Turkish principalities gained increasing autonomy. Beyliks such as Menteşe, Aydın, Saruhan, Karaman, and the Ottomans continued paying tribute to the Ilkhanids of Iran, but as Mongol influence weakened toward the end of the century, these frontier rulers steadily expanded their freedom and ambitions. Among them, Osman distinguished himself through relentless campaigns against the Byzantine frontier. He earned a reputation as a Ghazi, a warrior devoted to fighting in the name of Islam. Operating from his base around Söğüt, Osman transformed a small border territory into a growing military state. His victories attracted warriors, settlers, religious leaders, and adventurers from across Anatolia, all eager to share in the opportunities created by continuous expansion. Osman's achievements laid the foundation, but it was his son Orhan who turned the emerging state into a more organized political power. In 1326, Orhan captured Bursa after a prolonged campaign and declared it the Ottoman capital. The prosperous city became the empire's first administrative and commercial center. From Bursa, Ottoman armies continued pressing against Byzantine territory, taking Nicaea in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337, bringing much of northwestern Anatolia under Ottoman control. The Ottomans soon looked beyond Asia. In 1354, they crossed the Dardanelles and established their first permanent foothold in Europe by occupying Gallipoli. This seemingly modest gain proved revolutionary, giving the Ottomans direct access to the Balkans while they simultaneously expanded eastward by securing Ankara in central Anatolia. Fortune also favored them politically. After the death of the powerful Serbian ruler Stephen Dušan in 1355, his empire quickly fragmented, leaving southeastern Europe divided and vulnerable. Taking advantage of this instability, the Ottomans advanced deeper into Thrace. In 1361, they captured Adrianople, later known as Edirne, which soon became their new capital and an ideal base for further European campaigns. Under Sultan Murad I, Ottoman armies expanded across Thrace and southern Bulgaria, alarming both the papacy and the Orthodox rulers of the Balkans. Calls for resistance grew louder as Christian kingdoms recognized the growing danger posed by the rising Ottoman state. Despite these efforts, Murad achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of the Maritsa in 1371. The defeat shattered organized resistance across much of the Balkans and opened the way for Ottoman domination over large parts of Bulgaria, Macedonia, and southern Serbia. At the same time, Murad strengthened his position in Anatolia by absorbing neighboring Turkish principalities such as Yermiyan and Hamid. These annexations not only expanded Ottoman territory, but also reduced potential rivals within Anatolia itself. Throughout the following years, Ottoman forces continued their advance. Sofia fell in 1385, followed by Niš later that year, while Thessaloniki was brought under Ottoman control soon afterward. The empire was rapidly transforming from a frontier principality into the dominant military power of southeastern Europe. Alarmed by these successes, several Balkan states finally united despite their long-standing rivalries. Serbian, Bosnian, and Bulgarian armies briefly halted the Ottoman advance by defeating them at Plochnik in 1388. Although significant, the victory proved temporary. Murad quickly recovered and prepared for a far larger confrontation against a coalition assembled under the Serbian Prince Lazar. The decisive encounter came in June 1389 on the plain of Kosovo. One of medieval Europe's most famous battles unfolded as Ottoman and Christian armies fought fiercely throughout the day. When the fighting ended, the Ottomans had secured victory, although both Sultan Murad I and Prince Lazar lost their lives. The battle became a defining moment for both sides. For the Ottomans, it confirmed their supremacy in the Balkans. For the Serbs, Kosovo became a lasting symbol of sacrifice and national identity. Murad's son, Bayezid I, inherited the throne amid the aftermath of Kosovo and immediately continued his father's expansionist policies. Ottoman armies captured Skopje in 1391 before moving into Thessaly a few years later. By conquering northern Bulgaria, Bayezid forced Walachia's ruler, Mircea the Old, to acknowledge Ottoman overlordship. These victories placed Ottoman forces within striking distance of Hungary and Albania, dramatically shifting the balance of power in southeastern Europe. While strengthening his western front, Bayezid also focused on Anatolia. Between 1396 and 1397, he annexed the powerful Karamanid Principality, further consolidating Ottoman authority across the peninsula. His growing empire now stretched across both Europe and Asia, raising serious concerns among neighboring Christian kingdoms. Hungary viewed Ottoman expansion as an existential threat, particularly after Serbia ceased functioning as a protective buffer. Responding to appeals from Pope Boniface IX, King Sigismund of Hungary organized one of the largest crusading armies assembled in decades. Knights and soldiers from across Europe marched toward the Danube, determined to halt Ottoman expansion once and for all. Bayezid reacted with remarkable speed. Leaving Anatolia behind, he led his forces northward to intercept the Crusaders. In September 1396, the two armies met near Nicopolis. The result was a crushing Ottoman victory. Thousands of Crusaders perished in battle or drowned while attempting to escape across the Danube. The defeat shattered Western Europe's hopes of driving the Ottomans out of the Balkans and firmly established Bayezid as one of the most formidable rulers of his age. Following this triumph, Bayezid incorporated Vidin into his empire and turned his attention eastward. His ambitions increasingly brought him into conflict with the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt, Syria, and much of the Arab world. Ottoman armies occupied important towns such as Malatya and Elbistan, extending their influence toward the Euphrates Valley. Yet another, even greater challenge was approaching from Central Asia. Timur, already famous for conquering vast territories stretching from India to Iran, began advancing toward Anatolia around 1400. His forces devastated cities, including Sivas, while increasingly hostile exchanges between Timur and Bayezid made war inevitable. Certain of his military abilities and unwilling to tolerate Timur's insults, Bayezid marched east to confront his rival. Their armies finally met near Ankara in July 1402. The battle ended in catastrophe for the Ottomans. Timur's experienced army decisively defeated Bayezid, who was captured alongside several of his sons. The defeat nearly destroyed the Ottoman state. After his victory, Timur dismantled much of Bayezid's empire. Former Turkish principalities regained their independence, while Bayezid's surviving sons received separate territories, encouraging rivalry instead of unity. The result was more than a decade of dynastic conflict known as the Ottoman Interregnum, or the Fetrate period, during which rival princes fought relentlessly for supremacy. Eventually, Mehmed, governor of Amasya, emerged victorious. By 1413, he had defeated his brothers, reunified the fractured empire, and restored central authority. Although much had been lost, the Ottoman state had survived one of the greatest crises in its history. Mehmed I devoted his reign to rebuilding the institutions weakened during the Civil War. His successor, Murad II, continued this work while suppressing rebellions from rival claimants and reasserting Ottoman dominance over Anatolian principalities that had regained their independence after Timur's invasion. With internal stability restored, Ottoman expansion resumed in the Balkans. European rulers attempted once again to stop the advancing empire. King Vladislav of Poland and Hungary organized a new crusade, joined by Serbia under George Branković. The coalition's most gifted commander was John Hunyadi, governor of Transylvania, whose early campaigns pushed Ottoman forces out of parts of Bulgaria and briefly shifted momentum in favor of the Christians. Their success, however, proved short-lived. Murad II reorganized his armies and confronted the coalition near the Black Sea coast. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, the Ottomans achieved another overwhelming victory. King Vladislav was killed during the fighting, the crusading army collapsed, and the last major attempt by medieval Europe to prevent permanent Ottoman control of the Balkans came to a decisive end. From that point onward, the Ottoman advance into southeastern Europe would continue with renewed confidence, setting the stage for the empire's next great objective, Constantinople. The crushing victory at Varna secured Ottoman dominance in the Balkans and prepared the empire for one of the most significant moments in world history. Under Sultan Mehmed II, later remembered as Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottomans launched a campaign that would permanently transform both Europe and the Middle East. His greatest objective stood behind the massive walls of Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. After months of careful preparation, Ottoman forces surrounded the city in the spring of 1453. Massive cannons pounded its legendary defenses, while the Byzantine defenders struggled desperately to hold their ground. On May 29th, after a fierce final assault, Constantinople finally fell. The thousand-year-old Byzantine Empire disappeared, and the Ottomans inherited one of the world's greatest cities. Renamed Istanbul over time, it became the political, economic, and cultural heart of the expanding empire. More importantly, control of Constantinople placed the Ottomans at the crossroads of international trade, allowing them to dominate the sea routes linking the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. With his new capital secured, Mehmed immediately turned his attention toward completing the conquest of southeastern Europe. His armies swept through southern Greece, capturing the Peloponnese in 1458 before moving into Bosnia in 1463. Bosnia proved unique among the conquered Balkan territories. Large numbers of its ruling elite embraced Islam, and over time many towns and villages followed their example. This gradual religious transformation made Bosnia one of the most distinctive provinces within the Ottoman world. The conquest of Bosnia also opened the road toward Albania, where Ottoman expansion met determined resistance. The country's most famous defender was George Kastrioti, better known as Skanderbeg. A brilliant military commander, he united Albanian nobles and fought the Ottomans for more than 2 decades. Despite repeated invasions, Skanderbeg successfully frustrated Ottoman ambitions until his death in 1468, earning legendary status throughout Europe. While campaigns continued in the Western Balkans, the empire expanded its influence around the Black Sea. In 1475, the Crimean Khanate accepted Ottoman overlordship, giving the Sultan control over the northern Black Sea coastline and strengthening Ottoman naval influence. A few years later, Herzegovina also fell under Ottoman rule, completing another stage in the empire's advance across southeastern Europe. Not every campaign ended in success. Mehmed repeatedly attempted to seize Belgrade, one of the strongest fortresses guarding the route into Central Europe. Despite enormous efforts, the city remained unconquered. Its survival prevented the Ottomans from launching an immediate invasion of Hungary and temporarily slowed their expansion toward the heart of Europe. At the same time, new challenges emerged in the east. The Ak-Koyunlu Confederation, ruled by Uzun Hasan, controlled large parts of Iran and the southern Caucasus and sought to challenge Ottoman influence. Their alliance with Venice threatened Ottoman interests from both land and sea. Mehmed responded decisively. In 1473, Ottoman armies crushed Uzun Hasan's forces in a decisive battle, securing dominance over eastern Anatolia. The struggle with Venice continued for several years. Venetian fleets and fortresses remained formidable obstacles throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman armies eventually gained the upper hand by capturing important strongholds, including the strategic fortress of Shkodër in 1479. These victories further weakened Venetian influence in the Adriatic and strengthened Ottoman control over regional trade and military routes. By the final years of Mehmed's reign, Ottoman ambitions stretched beyond the Balkans altogether. In 1480, Ottoman troops crossed the Adriatic Sea and occupied Otranto in southern Italy. The operation appeared to be only the beginning of a much larger invasion aimed at the Italian peninsula. However, Mehmed's sudden death in 1481 brought these plans to an abrupt end before they could be fully realized. Following Mehmed's death, a struggle for succession erupted between his sons. After defeating his brother Cem, Bayezid II secured the throne and sought to consolidate rather than dramatically expand the empire. His attention focused on strengthening Ottoman control around the Black Sea. Campaigns against Moldavia resulted in the capture of the important ports of Kilia and Akerman in 1484, extending Ottoman influence over crucial commercial waterways. These gains inevitably drew the Ottomans into conflict with neighboring powers. Poland opposed Ottoman expansion in the region, while long-running wars with Hungary and Venice continued throughout Bayezid's reign. In the east, tensions with the Mamluk Sultanate eventually eased when both sides agreed to a peace settlement in 1491, providing temporary stability along the empire's southeastern frontier. Even as one conflict ended, another far more dangerous rival emerged. In Iran, the Safavid dynasty rose rapidly under the charismatic Shah Ismail. Unlike previous regional powers, the Safavids combined military strength with a powerful religious movement based on Shia Islam. Their growing influence spread into eastern Anatolia, where many tribes openly supported Shah Ismail, creating a serious internal and external challenge for Ottoman authority. Bayezid II, now elderly and increasingly unable to respond effectively, struggled to contain the Safavid threat. His weakness encouraged political instability within the Ottoman court. In 1512, his ambitious son Selim seized the throne, ending his father's reign and preparing the empire for a dramatic new phase of expansion. Selim I wasted little time confronting the Safavids. In August 1514, the two empires met at the Battle of Chaldiran. Ottoman artillery and disciplined infantry overwhelmed Shah Ismail's forces, giving Selim a decisive victory and securing eastern Anatolia. The campaign also brought Azerbaijan under temporary Ottoman control and demonstrated the growing superiority of Ottoman military organization. Selim's ambitions soon shifted south toward the wealthy Mamluk Sultanate. Ottoman armies invaded Syria in 1516 before advancing into Egypt the following year. The Mamluk armies collapsed under Ottoman pressure, and within months, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and the Hejaz all came under Ottoman rule. Perhaps even more significant was the inclusion of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities of Islam, which greatly enhanced the religious prestige of the Ottoman sultans. The conquest of Egypt transformed the empire economically as well as politically. Cairo became the center of an enormously wealthy province that generated vast tax revenues for the imperial treasury. Through Egypt, the Ottomans gained access to lucrative trade networks carrying African gold and valuable spices from the Indian Ocean to Mediterranean markets. Control over these commercial routes significantly increased the empire's wealth and strategic importance. Ottoman expansion also extended into the Red Sea and northeastern Africa. By strengthening both their military and naval presence, the Ottomans established dominance over the Red Sea, protected the pilgrimage routes to Mecca, and expanded their authority into territories stretching across present-day Sudan, coastal Ethiopia, Djibouti, and neighboring regions. These acquisitions secured vital maritime routes connecting the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. When Selim died in 1520, his son Suleiman inherited an empire already larger than any previous Ottoman ruler had governed. Known in Europe as Suleiman the Magnificent, he would lead the empire during what many historians regard as its greatest age of military, political, and cultural achievement. One of Suleiman's first objectives was Belgrade, whose stubborn resistance had frustrated his grandfather decades earlier. In 1521, the fortress finally fell, opening the gateway into Central Europe. The following year, Ottoman forces launched another spectacular campaign, this time against the island of Rhodes. Despite fierce resistance from the Knights of St. John, the island surrendered after a lengthy siege, giving the Ottomans complete control over the eastern Mediterranean. With his southern flank secured, Suleiman invaded Hungary. In 1526, the Ottoman army confronted King Louis II at the Battle of Mohacs. The engagement lasted only a few hours, but completely destroyed the Hungarian kingdom. King Louis died during the retreat, and medieval Hungary effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. The collapse of Hungary brought the Ottoman Empire face to face with the Habsburg monarchy. Conflict between these two great powers became inevitable. In 1529, Suleiman advanced toward Vienna, hoping to capture the Habsburg capital and secure dominance over Central Europe. Although Ottoman forces reached the city, heavy rains, poor roads, and severe logistical difficulties forced the Sultan to abandon the siege before achieving victory. While confronting Europe, Suleiman also campaigned repeatedly against the Safavid Empire. Ottoman armies occupied Baghdad, Tabriz, and Hamadan during successive invasions, extending imperial authority deep into Mesopotamia and western Iran. Years of warfare eventually ended with the Treaty of Amasya in 1555, which established a stable frontier and confirmed Ottoman control over much of Iraq, eastern Anatolia, and parts of the Caucasus. Ottoman supremacy was not limited to land. Recognizing the importance of naval power, Suleiman dramatically expanded the imperial fleet and appointed the legendary admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa to command it. Under his leadership, Ottoman ships dominated the Mediterranean, capturing Tunis and forcing rival European powers to acknowledge Ottoman naval superiority across much of the sea. Further south, Ottoman authority continued to spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. The conquest of Sana'a in Yemen strengthened imperial control over the Red Sea while protecting the trade routes and pilgrimage roads linking Egypt with the holy cities of Arabia. By the middle of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had become one of the most powerful states on earth. Its territory stretched from Hungary to the Persian Gulf and from Algeria to the Arabian Peninsula. Its armies were feared across Europe, Asia, and Africa, while its fleets controlled vast portions of the Mediterranean and Red Sea. Yet beneath this extraordinary success, subtle problems had already begun to emerge. Administrative pressures increased as the empire grew larger, military institutions gradually became less flexible, and political rivalries within the court intensified. Although these weaknesses remained largely hidden during Suleiman's brilliant reign, they would become increasingly visible after his death. When Suleiman's son Selim II came to the throne in 1566, the empire remained enormously powerful, but historians often view his reign as the beginning of a long period of gradual transformation. The Ottoman Empire did not suddenly collapse or enter immediate decline. Instead, the challenges that had quietly developed during the empire's golden age slowly accumulated over generations. Only many decades later would these structural weaknesses become impossible for both contemporaries and historians to ignore. By the opening years of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was still one of the largest powers in the world, but clear signs of military strain were beginning to appear. The first major warning came not from Europe, but from the empire's eastern frontier. In Iran, Shah Abbas I rebuilt the Safavid state, reorganized its army, and launched a determined campaign to recover territories previously lost to the Ottomans. The Safavid advance was swift and devastating. Ottoman garrisons in Azerbaijan and the Caucasus were caught unprepared as Iranian forces seized Tabriz in 1603 and Nakhchivan the following year. Yerevan and Kars were attacked soon afterward, while Shah Abbas used Armenia as a base for further operations across the eastern Caucasus. His armies pushed northward into Shirvan, overturning much of the regional order the Ottomans had established during the previous century. This crisis erupted at a particularly difficult moment for the Ottoman government. Sultan Mehmed III died in 1603, leaving the throne to the young Ahmed I. The new sultan responded by assembling a much larger army and sending it eastward in the hope of stopping the Iranian advance. Yet when Ottoman and Safavid forces met in September 1605, numbers alone could not guarantee victory. Shah Abbas defeated the larger Ottoman army and strengthened his position across the region. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Ottoman authority weakened throughout eastern Anatolia, Iraq, and parts of the Arab provinces. Several Kurdish and Turkoman tribal leaders shifted their loyalty toward the Safavids or took advantage of the disorder to act independently. Rebellions spread across the frontier zones, and unrest became especially dangerous in Syria, where Kurdish groups rose against the central government. The empire eventually recovered part of its strength under Murad IV. Determined to restore discipline and reverse Safavid gains, Murad imposed harsh order within the state before leading major campaigns toward the east. His most important success came with the reconquest of Baghdad, which returned Iraq to Ottoman rule and restored imperial authority over much of the Arab Middle East. Ottoman control of Baghdad and Iraq would continue, with interruptions until the First World War. In 1639, the prolonged struggle between the Ottomans and the Safavids finally ended with the Treaty of Zuhab, signed near Qasr-e-Shirin. The settlement created a more stable frontier between the two empires. Iraq remained under Ottoman rule, while the Safavids kept Azerbaijan and much of the southern Caucasus. Although tensions continued, this agreement established the basic border between the two states for generations. Murad IV died in 1640 and was succeeded by his brother Ibrahim. Unlike Murad, Ibrahim had spent nearly his entire life confined within the palace and had received little preparation for government. He lacked both political experience and the confidence necessary to control the powerful groups surrounding the throne. As Ibrahim became increasingly absorbed in palace life, real power was contested by his mother, tutors, senior ministers, court officials, eunuchs, and janissary commanders. The imperial government became unstable, while factional struggles weakened central authority. Ibrahim was eventually removed and killed in 1648. His young son Mehmed IV then became sultan. Because he was still a child, the empire was once again ruled through competing palace factions. His grandmother, mother, grand vizier, chief eunuch, and military commanders all attempted to influence state policy. The result was political confusion at the center and growing disorder across the provinces. By the middle of the century, the Ottoman state faced a severe combination of financial crisis, military setbacks, naval weakness, and administrative corruption. Venetian forces had placed pressure on the capital by controlling vital sea routes, and the Ottoman fleet repeatedly failed to break their blockade. The situation became so serious that the government turned to a man known for discipline and administrative ability, Mehmed Köprülü. Appointed Grand Vizier in 1656, Köprülü demanded unusually broad authority before accepting office. He wanted the freedom to punish corruption, remove incompetent officials, and act without interference from palace factions. The Sultan agreed, and Köprülü began a forceful campaign to restore order. Mehmed Köprülü came from an Albanian family and had spent years serving in both the palace and the provinces. His long career gave him a deep understanding of the imperial system, while his reputation for determination made him an ideal figure for a government in crisis. Once in power, he suppressed rebellions, dismissed unreliable officials, strengthened the treasury, and restored a measure of discipline within the army and administration. After his death in 1661, his son Fazıl Ahmet Köprülü succeeded him as Grand Vizier. This transfer of power marked the beginning of what became known as the Köprülü era, a period during which several members of the same family dominated Ottoman politics and attempted to revive the strength of the state. Fazıl Ahmet continued his father's policies. He crushed uprisings in Anatolia, reasserted central authority in distant provinces, and pursued an aggressive foreign policy in Europe. One of his principal aims was to resist Habsburg interference in Transylvania and prevent the expansion of a Catholic alliance backed by the papacy. In 1664, Ottoman forces confronted a European coalition near St. Gotthard. The Allied army included Habsburg, French, Spanish, and other Catholic units. The Ottomans suffered a serious defeat and lost large numbers of soldiers and equipment. Yet the peace agreement that followed was surprisingly favorable to Istanbul. Under the Treaty of Vassar, Habsburg forces withdrew from several positions, and Ottoman influence over Transylvania remained largely intact. Fazıl Ahmet died in 1676 and was succeeded by his brother-in-law, Mirzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara Mustafa inherited the political vision of the Köprülü ministers, but carried it with greater ambition. He sought to limit Russian expansion near the Black Sea and break Habsburg power in Central Europe. By the early 1680s, he became convinced that the Habsburg monarchy was vulnerable. France, then engaged in its own rivalry with the Habsburgs, encouraged the Ottomans to attack from the east. Believing that a successful campaign could transform the balance of power in Europe, Kara Mustafa assembled a large army and marched toward Vienna in the summer of 1683. By July, the Ottoman army had surrounded the Habsburg capital. The siege created panic across Europe, but it also gave the defenders time to organize a major relief force. The Habsburg Emperor secured support from Poland, the papacy, and several Catholic powers. The most important figure in the coalition was the Polish king Jan Sobieski, who led his troops toward Vienna. On September 12, 1683, the relief army attacked the Ottoman positions. The battle ended in disaster for Kara Mustafa. Ottoman lines collapsed, thousands of soldiers were killed, and the besieging army lost its discipline. Heavy artillery, ammunition, supplies, and valuable equipment were abandoned during the retreat. Kara Mustafa attempted to regroup his forces at Belgrade, but the political damage was already irreversible. His enemies at court portrayed him as the sole architect of the catastrophe. Rather than accepting responsibility for the broader strategic failure, the Ottoman government placed the blame on the Grand Vizier. On December 25, 1683, he was executed by order of the Sultan. His death did nothing to solve the crisis. In fact, it made the situation worse. The army had lost not only men and equipment, but also experienced leadership. Ottoman forces in Europe were disorganized and increasingly unable to resist coordinated attacks. In 1684, a new Holy League was formed against the empire. It brought together the Habsburg monarchy, Venice, Poland, the papacy, Malta, Tuscany, and later Russia. For the first time in many years, the Ottomans faced a broad and sustained military alliance on several fronts at once. The following war proved catastrophic. Ottoman armies lost fortresses, provinces, and strategic routes across Central and Southeastern Europe. Repeated attempts to recover the lost territories failed, while the costs of war placed enormous pressure on the imperial treasury. By 1698, the Ottoman government had little choice but to negotiate. Talks began with representatives of the Holy League and resulted in the Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in January 1699. The agreement marked one of the greatest territorial reversals in Ottoman history. The Habsburgs retained most of Hungary and Transylvania, leaving the Ottomans only the Banat of Temeshvar in the region. Poland regained Podolia, while Russia strengthened its position around Azov and north of the Dniester. Venice received Dalmatia, the Morea, and several strategically important Aegean islands. The Sultan also agreed to guarantee greater religious freedom for Catholic communities living under Ottoman rule. Karlowitz signaled a profound shift in the balance of power. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the state that consistently forced its enemies to surrender territory. It had now entered an age in which it increasingly had to defend its own borders and accept unfavorable diplomatic settlements. The empire entered the 18th century exhausted. Decades of war against the Habsburgs, Venice, Poland, and Russia had drained the treasury. Soldiers and officials often went unpaid, while provincial administration became increasingly corrupt. Nepotism spread, tax collection grew harsher, and local power holders gained greater independence from Istanbul. The memory of powerful rulers such as Mehmed II, Selim I, and Suleiman the Magnificent now seemed distant. The imperial system still possessed enormous resources, but its institutions were under severe pressure. Reform was no longer optional. It had become essential for survival. Once again, the ruling elite turned to the Köprülü family. In 1697, Amkazadeh Hüseyin Pasha became Grand Vizier and attempted to repair the damage caused by prolonged warfare. He sought to reduce government spending, strengthen the treasury, improve administration, and ease the financial burden placed on the peasantry. His reforms, however, threatened powerful groups who benefited from the existing system. Court factions, military interests, and members of the traditional elite resisted any effort that might reduce their influence or income. Faced with mounting opposition, Hussein Pasha was forced to leave office in 1702. This pattern would repeat itself many times in Ottoman history. Reformers recognized the need for change, but every attempt to strengthen the state challenged people whose status depended on the old order. The empire had survived the crisis of the 17th century, but the struggle between reform and resistance would shape its future for the next 200 years. The Ottoman Empire entered the 18th century burdened by financial disorder, political conflict, and the consequences of repeated military defeats. Taxes were not collected efficiently, officials and soldiers often waited months for their salaries, and the treasury struggled to meet even its most basic obligations. Corruption spread throughout the administration, while powerful individuals increasingly used public offices for personal gain. Sultan Mustafa II remained largely detached from the growing crisis. He spent much of his reign in Edirne, far from the political tensions of Istanbul, and failed to understand how deeply dissatisfaction had spread through the capital. The immediate spark came when troops ordered to march toward the southern Caucasus refused to move until their unpaid wages were delivered. What began as a military protest quickly turned into a broad urban uprising. Janissaries and other soldiers were soon joined by artisans, merchants, shopkeepers, and students from the religious schools. In July 1703, the streets of Istanbul filled with angry crowds demanding change. Mustafa II attempted to calm the situation by dismissing his Grand Vizier, but this concession only convinced the rebels that the palace was weak. They marched from Istanbul toward Edirne, where the Sultan had gathered loyal forces to confront them. A major battle appeared inevitable. The confrontation ended before serious fighting could begin. Many of the soldiers serving under Mustafa abandoned him and crossed over to the rebel side. With his army collapsing and his authority destroyed, the Sultan had no choice but to abdicate. His brother took the throne as Ahmed III. The new government understood that the empire desperately needed time to recover. Ottoman leaders therefore tried to avoid another major war while rebuilding the treasury, reducing state expenses, and reorganizing the army. The defeats of the previous decades and the humiliating settlement at Karlowitz remained fresh in the minds of senior officials. Few wished to risk another catastrophe. This cautious policy, however, was interpreted by Russia as a sign of weakness. Tsar Peter the Great had already transformed his country into a rising military power. In 1709, he defeated Charles XII of Sweden at the Battle of Poltava, destroying one of Russia's most dangerous European rivals. Charles fled south and sought refuge in Ottoman territory. His presence, combined with Russia's growing influence near the Black Sea, increased tensions between Istanbul and St. Petersburg. Peter eventually moved his forces toward the Ottoman frontier, expecting support from local rulers in Wallachia and Moldavia. That support never fully arrived. The princes of the two principalities hesitated and failed to provide the assistance they had promised. In July 1711, Peter crossed the Pruth River into Moldavia, but his army soon found itself isolated and short of supplies. As the Russians attempted to withdraw, Ottoman forces surrounded them near the river. For a brief moment, Peter the Great and much of the Russian army appeared to be completely trapped. The Ottoman Grand Vizier possessed an opportunity to destroy the force and perhaps capture the Tsar himself. Peter responded by offering generous terms. He agreed to return territories taken from the Ottomans, surrender military equipment, and dismantle several Russian forts near the frontier. He also promised to reduce Russian involvement in Ottoman affairs. The Ottoman commander accepted the settlement and allowed the Russian army to escape. In return, Russian merchants received permission to trade more freely in Ottoman lands, while Istanbul agreed to help mediate between Russia and Sweden. Although the Ottomans had gained important concessions, many later criticized the decision not to eliminate Peter's army when the opportunity had presented itself. The war also produced major changes in Wallachia and Moldavia. Their native rulers had secretly negotiated with Russia, convincing the Ottoman government that they could no longer be trusted. Istanbul therefore began replacing many local princes with governors directly appointed by the Sultan. These new rulers were usually selected from wealthy Greek families living in the Fana district of Istanbul. Known as Fanariots, They had long served the empire as diplomats, translators, and interpreters. Their knowledge of Ottoman Turkish and several European languages made them valuable to the central government. Yet their growing influence created resentment among the local populations. Greek language, customs, and political networks became increasingly dominant in the administration of Wallachia and Moldavia. Many local elites came to view the Phanariot governors as outsiders imposed by Istanbul. Despite peace with Russia, political conflict within the Ottoman court continued. Supporters of a peaceful northern policy eventually prevailed, and a new agreement with Russia was signed in 1713. Peter promised to abandon certain Black Sea territories, withdraw from Poland, and allow Charles XII to return safely to Sweden. The Russian retreat strengthened the position of those who wanted a new war against Venice. Their main objective was the recovery of the Morea, which the Ottomans had lost at Karlowitz. In 1715, Ottoman forces launched a successful campaign and quickly reconquered the peninsula. Victory over Venice encouraged further expansion, but Ottoman advances toward Croatia alarmed the Habsburg monarchy. Austria entered the conflict on Venice's side, once again bringing the empire into direct confrontation with one of Europe's most powerful military states. The results were disastrous. In August 1716, the Ottoman army suffered a major defeat at Petrovaradin. Its defensive lines collapsed, and the Habsburgs captured Temeshvar shortly afterward. In August 1717, Belgrade also fell. These losses shattered the influence of the pro-war faction in Istanbul. Ahmed III responded by appointing his trusted advisor, Nevşehirli Damad Ibrahim Pasha, as Grand Vizier in May 1718. His task was to negotiate peace and stabilize the empire. The resulting Treaty of Passarowitz was signed in July 1718. The Habsburgs gained the Banat of Temeshvar, northern Serbia, Belgrade, and Oltenia, the western part of Wallachia. Their merchants were also granted wider trading privileges throughout Ottoman territory. The agreement gave Catholic clergy renewed protections as well. This allowed the Habsburg Emperor to present himself as the defender of Catholic communities living under Ottoman rule, providing Vienna with another way to interfere in the empire's internal affairs. The Peace of Passarowitz opened a very different chapter in Ottoman history. Damad Ibrahim Pasha believed that constant warfare had exhausted the state and that the empire needed diplomacy, cultural renewal, and selective reform. The period that followed became famous as the Tulip Era. Ibrahim Pasha reorganized the palace environment and filled important positions with his own supporters. He also encouraged Ahmed III to focus less on military campaigns and more on courtly life, architecture, gardens, poetry, and entertainment. One of the most celebrated symbols of the age was the Sadabad Palace, or the Palace of Happiness. Inspired by European royal residences, especially those of France, it was built as a center of imperial leisure. Its gardens, fountains, pavilions, and artificial waterways became models for wealthy Ottoman statesmen who constructed similar residences along the Bosphorus. Ibrahim Pasha himself built an elegant palace on the Asian shore of the strait. Its design reflected growing interest in French decorative styles, carefully planned gardens, and ornamental fountains. The tulip became the defining symbol of the period. Rare varieties were cultivated by wealthy families, displayed in private gardens, and sometimes sold at extraordinary prices. Because of this fascination, the age later became known as Leil Devri, the tulip period. Nighttime celebrations in palace gardens became famous. Candles were placed on the backs of turtles, which slowly moved between illuminated flower beds. Poets recited new works, musicians performed for court audiences, and foreign diplomats watched elaborate displays of Ottoman luxury. The atmosphere of entertainment was not limited entirely to the ruling elite. Ordinary people could not build Bosphorus palaces, but they increasingly gathered in coffee houses. These establishments became important spaces for conversation, music, storytelling, political discussion, and public leisure. Behind the elegance of the period, Ibrahim Pasha pursued a serious diplomatic program. He believed that war should be used only when negotiations had failed. Ottoman ambassadors were sent to major European capitals, not merely to conduct diplomacy, but also to observe Western institutions and technologies. These envoys visited military facilities, workshops, hospitals, gardens, factories, and scientific institutions. They reported on fortifications, weapons, urban planning, and technical innovations that might be useful to the empire. One of the most important developments was the establishment of a Turkish-language printing press in 1727. Printing had long existed among the empire's Christian and Jewish communities, but the new press was intended to publish works in Ottoman Turkish. Religious scholars and professional scribes immediately objected. Some feared that printed books would reduce their authority, while others worried that copying errors might corrupt sacred texts. The government responded by limiting the press to non-religious subjects, especially history, geography, science, and literature. The peaceful mood of the Tulip era did not last. A sudden crisis in Iran drew the empire back into war. Ottoman-Safavid relations had remained relatively stable since the 17th century settlement at Qasr-e-Shirin, but the Safavid state collapsed rapidly after Afghan rebels captured Isfahan in 1722 and removed Shah Sultan Hussein from power. The disappearance of effective authority in Iran created both opportunity and danger. Ahmed III and Ibrahim Pasha hoped to occupy western Iranian provinces, increase tax revenues, and prevent instability from spreading across the Ottoman frontier. Russia had similar ambitions. After defeating Sweden, Peter the Great looked south toward the Caspian region. Control of Iran could provide Russia with access to the Persian Gulf, Indian trade routes, and the warmer waters that had long attracted Russian rulers. Ottoman armies initially advanced successfully into western Iran. Their position soon became more difficult, however, with the rise of Nader Koli, the brilliant military commander who would later become Nader Shah. He reorganized Iranian forces and began driving the Ottomans out of the territories they had occupied. By 1730, the government's decision to launch another expensive eastern campaign provoked fury in Istanbul. Many soldiers and ordinary residents believed that the palace had become obsessed with luxury while ignoring military weakness and economic suffering. The revolt was led by Patrona Halil, an Albanian former sailor associated with the Janissary Corps. He denounced Ahmed III and Ibrahim Pasha as corrupt, wasteful, and incapable of defending the empire. The rebels quickly gained support. Ahmed attempted to save his throne by dismissing Ibrahim Pasha and ordering his execution. Yet the uprising continued. Encouraged by their success, the rebels demanded that the Sultan himself step down. Ahmed III lacked sufficient military support to resist. He was removed from power and replaced by Mahmud I. The Tulip era ended abruptly, and many of its palaces and symbols of luxury were attacked or destroyed. Patrona Halil briefly became one of the most powerful men in the capital, but Mahmud I had no intention of allowing the rebellion to control his reign. A few weeks later, the Sultan invited Patrona to the palace, where royal guards killed him. His leading supporters were hunted down and executed. War with Iran continued for years. Ottoman and Iranian forces exchanged territories through repeated campaigns until a peace agreement was finally reached in 1746. The settlement largely restored the frontier established more than a century earlier at Qasr-e-Shirin. During the later reign of Mahmud I and those of Osman III and Mustafa III, the Ottoman government avoided involvement in Europe's largest wars. It stayed outside both the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. Even the assassination of Nader Shah in 1747 did not persuade Istanbul to invade Iran. The Ottomans appeared to have gained a rare period of peace in which they could rebuild the army, reform the treasury, and modernize the administration. That opportunity was largely wasted. Instead of carrying out deep reforms, the government became complacent. Military weaknesses remained unresolved, administrative corruption continued, and technological differences between the empire and its European rivals became more dangerous. The consequences became clear in 1768 when Russia under Catherine the Great launched a new war. Catherine aimed to expand Russian influence along the Black Sea and weaken Ottoman authority over its Christian subjects. Although Ottoman forces achieved a few early successes, the campaign soon turned against them. In 1769, Russian armies won a major victory and occupied Wallachia and Moldavia. The following year brought an even more shocking disaster. A Russian fleet entered the Mediterranean and attacked the Ottoman navy at Cheshme. The Ottoman ships, crowded together in the harbor, were destroyed in a devastating nighttime assault. After 6 years of warfare, the empire was forced to accept the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca in 1774. Mustafa III had died shortly before the agreement, leaving the throne to Abdülhamid I. The treaty had enormous consequences. Crimea was declared independent from the Ottoman Empire, although in practice it soon fell under Russian influence. Russia received commercial, territorial, and diplomatic advantages and strengthened its claim to protect Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. In 1783, Catherine formally annexed Crimea. The loss was especially painful because the Crimean Khanate had been an Ottoman ally for centuries and had played an essential role in the political and military balance of the Black Sea region. Russia now possessed a powerful base on the northern coast and emerged as the dominant naval force in the Black Sea. The strategic environment of the empire had been permanently transformed. The struggle resumed in 1787. Austria joined Russia the following year, forcing the Ottomans to fight another exhausting war on several fronts. Sweden and Prussia provided diplomatic and limited strategic support, but they could not reverse Ottoman losses. By 1791, all sides were weary. The Treaty of Sistova ended the conflict with Austria. 1 year later, the Treaty of Jassy concluded the Russian War and confirmed further Russian expansion along the northern Black Sea coast. These defeats deeply affected the new Sultan, Selim III, who had come to the throne in 1789. He recognized that the traditional Ottoman military system could no longer compete effectively with the disciplined armies of Europe. Selim launched an ambitious reform program known as the Nizam-ı-Cedid, or New Order. At its center stood a modern army trained according to European tactics, equipped with improved weapons, and commanded through a more regular hierarchy. The reforms also included new military institutions. A modern military hospital was established, and in 1795 an engineering school was founded to train officers in mathematics, fortification, artillery, and technical subjects. Selim understood that military reform required more than copying European uniforms or drill. It demanded new sources of revenue, new schools, foreign expertise, and a fundamental change in the relationship between the army and the state. At the same time, Europe was being transformed by revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 shocked the Ottoman court, especially because France had long been regarded as a valuable diplomatic partner. The execution of Louis XVI appeared to Ottoman observers as a terrifying example of rebellion against legitimate monarchy. An even greater shock came in 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. The French occupation threatened one of the empire's richest provinces and disrupted the strategic routes connecting Istanbul with the Red Sea and the Holy Cities. Selim sought assistance from Britain and Russia. Ottoman and British forces resisted the French advance, while Napoleon failed to capture Acre. Although the French won a battle at Abukir on land, their wider position in Egypt became unsustainable. Napoleon eventually abandoned the expedition and returned to France. Ottoman and British pressure forced the remaining French army to evacuate Egypt. Relations between Istanbul and Paris were later restored, particularly after Russia again moved against Wallachia and Moldavia in 1806. Selim's reforms, however, had created powerful enemies at home. The Janissaries feared that the new army would replace them. Religious leaders worried about European influence, while officials and provincial notables resisted changes that threatened their privileges. By 1807, these different groups had formed a united opposition. When rebellion broke out, Selim hesitated. Although he possessed the new military units created by his reforms, he refused to order them into action against the insurgents. His restraint proved fatal. The rebels demanded the destruction of the new order and the removal of the Sultan. Selim was deposed, and his cousin took the throne as Mustafa IV. Supporters of reform refused to accept this outcome. Several provincial notables, known as Ayans, remained loyal to Selim. The most powerful among them was Bayraktar Mustafa Pasha of Rus, who gathered troops and marched toward Istanbul. Bayraktar intended to remove Mustafa IV and restore Selim III. As his forces entered the capital, Mustafa IV realized that his own throne was in danger. He ordered the execution of Selim and Mahmud, the only other male members of the dynasty capable of replacing him. The assassins reached Selim first and killed him. Mahmud, however, managed to escape. According to later accounts, he hid within the palace until Bayraktar's men secured the complex. Mustafa IV was removed from the throne, and Mahmud emerged as the sole surviving alternative. With Bayraktar's support, he became Sultan Mahmud II. He inherited an empire divided between reformers and defenders of the old order. The failure of Selim III had shown how dangerous modernization could be when the central government lacked the power to overcome entrenched interests. Mahmud II would remember that lesson. Unlike his predecessor, he would eventually conclude that the empire could not be transformed while the institutions resisting change remained intact. His reign would therefore become one of the most dramatic and violent periods of reform in Ottoman history. During the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced a new and increasingly dangerous challenge. This threat did not come only from rival states or invading armies. It emerged from within the empire itself, as Christian communities in the Balkans began to demand political autonomy and national independence. The first major uprising broke out in Serbia in 1804. A more dramatic revolution followed in Greece in 1821. These movements were shaped by local grievances, but they were also encouraged by the spread of modern nationalism and supported by European powers that hoped to weaken Ottoman influence in southeastern Europe. The Ottoman political order was poorly prepared to confront this new ideology. For centuries, the empire had governed a population divided by religion rather than nationality. Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, and other groups belonged to legally recognized religious communities, commonly known as millets. This arrangement had provided religious communities with considerable autonomy. Their leaders supervised worship, education, marriage, inheritance, and many other internal affairs. In an age when religion was the primary source of collective identity, the system had helped maintain peace across an extraordinarily diverse empire. Yet the same structure produced an unintended result. By allowing religious communities to preserve their schools, traditions, languages, and institutions, the Ottoman government also helped distinct cultural identities survive. When nationalism began spreading across Europe, these preserved traditions could be transformed into the foundations of modern national movements. The French Revolution introduced a political language based on citizenship, popular sovereignty, liberty, and national belonging. By the end of the 18th century, educated Balkan Christians increasingly encountered these ideas through European schools, merchants, diplomats, books, and revolutionary organizations. A new intelligentsia gradually emerged. Its members no longer accepted that religious officials should speak for the entire community. They challenged both the Ottoman administration and the traditional church hierarchies that had often cooperated with Istanbul. Religion remained important, but language, ancestry, shared history, and national territory were becoming powerful sources of political identity. The Serbian revolt forced the Ottoman government to recognize an autonomous Serbian principality during the years 1814 and 1815. The Greek struggle proved even more damaging. After years of warfare and foreign intervention, an independent Greek kingdom was formally established in 1832. These losses did not persuade Sultan Mahmud II to abandon his centralizing ambitions. On the contrary, they strengthened his determination to build a more disciplined state and a modern army capable of crushing rebellions and resisting European pressure. The greatest obstacle was the Janissary Corps. Once an elite military force, the Janissaries had become deeply involved in trade, urban politics, and palace struggles. They repeatedly resisted reform because modernization threatened their privileges and social influence. Mahmud understood that every reform program would remain vulnerable as long as the Janissaries survived. In June 1826, he finally moved against them. After provoking the Corps into open rebellion, the government used artillery and loyal troops to destroy their barracks and suppress their resistance. The Janissary institution was then abolished. Thousands of its members were killed, imprisoned, exiled, or removed from official positions. The event became known in Ottoman history as the Auspicious Incident. Destroying the Janissaries removed one of the most powerful opponents of reform, but it also created a serious military vacuum. Mahmud could eliminate the old army in a matter of days, yet he could not immediately replace it with a trained and effective modern force. This weakness damaged Ottoman efforts to retain Greece. European intervention, especially from Britain, France, and Russia, helped determine the outcome of the conflict. The loss of Greece was a severe blow to Ottoman authority, but an even more dangerous challenge soon arose from Egypt. The man responsible was Muhammad Ali, known in Ottoman Turkish as Mehmed Ali Pasha. Originally an Albanian officer from the region of Kavala, he had risen to power during the political disorder that followed the French occupation of Egypt. Through military skill, political manipulation, and the elimination of his rivals, Muhammad Ali became the effective ruler of the province. Although he formally remained an Ottoman governor, he built an increasingly independent state. With assistance from French officers and advisors, he created a modern army based on conscription, European drill, centralized command, and improved artillery. He also reorganized taxation, agriculture, education, and administration to provide the resources required by his military system. Mahmud II recognized the strength of the Egyptian forces and requested Muhammad Ali's support during the Greek Revolution. Egyptian troops under Muhammad Ali's son, Ibrahim Pasha, fought effectively in Greece and temporarily placed the revolutionaries under severe pressure. European intervention eventually reversed their successes. The Egyptian fleet was destroyed at Navarino in 1827, and Ibrahim was forced to withdraw his troops. Muhammad Ali expected substantial territorial compensation for his losses, but the Sultan refused to satisfy his demands. The governor initially considered expanding westward into Tunisia and Algeria. France, however, invaded Algiers in 1830 and blocked Egyptian ambitions in that direction. Muhammad Ali and Ibrahim Pasha therefore turned toward the Ottoman provinces of the eastern Mediterranean. In October 1831, Egyptian forces invaded Palestine and Syria. Acre, one of the strongest fortresses in the region, fell in May 1832 after a prolonged siege. Damascus was occupied the following month. Ottoman armies sent to stop Ibrahim were defeated repeatedly, allowing Egyptian forces to establish control over Syria. The Sultan rejected proposals for compromise, believing that further resistance could reverse the crisis. Instead, Ibrahim advanced into Anatolia and defeated another Ottoman army. By early 1833, Egyptian forces had reached Kütahya in western Anatolia. The road toward Istanbul appeared open, and the survival of the Ottoman dynasty itself was in question. Mahmud urgently sought help from Europe. Britain and Austria refused to intervene immediately, leaving him with few options. In desperation, he turned to Russia, the empire's traditional enemy. Russia agreed to assist. A Russian fleet arrived near Istanbul in February 1833, while Russian troops prepared to defend the capital. Their presence discouraged Ibrahim from advancing farther. The intervention saved Mahmud's throne, but it also demonstrated how weak the Ottoman state had become. A sultan, who had spent much of his reign resisting Russian expansion, now depended on Russian soldiers for survival against one of his own governors. The crisis was temporarily settled through the Convention of Kütahya in 1833. Muhammad Ali retained Egypt and received authority over Syria, while Ibrahim was granted additional administrative control in the region. A few months later, Mahmud signed the Treaty of Hunkar İskelesi with Russia. The agreement created an 8-year defensive alliance. A secret provision required the Ottomans to close the Turkish straits to foreign warships if Russia became involved in a conflict. Britain and France viewed the treaty with alarm. They feared that Russia had gained excessive influence over Istanbul and might eventually dominate the straits, threatening the Mediterranean balance of power. Mahmud never accepted the loss of Syria as permanent. He rebuilt his army and prepared for another confrontation with Muhammad Ali. Britain also became increasingly hostile toward the Egyptian governor, whom it regarded as a French client and a threat to British trade routes leading toward India. By 1838, tensions had again reached a dangerous level. Muhammad Ali openly discussed declaring complete independence. France, his closest European partner, advised him against taking such a provocative step, and he temporarily withdrew the threat. Mahmud used the crisis to seek British support. Britain demanded economic advantages in return. In August 1838, the Ottoman government signed a major commercial agreement that expanded British trading privileges and opened Ottoman markets more widely to European manufactured goods. The agreement strengthened political cooperation with London, but it also weakened the empire's ability to protect local production. British merchants gained broad access to Ottoman markets, while many domestic craftsmen struggled to compete with cheaper industrial imports. Despite British warnings, Mahmud launched another military campaign against Muhammad Ali's forces in Syria. In June 1839, the Ottoman army was once again defeated by Ibrahim Pasha. The disaster was followed by another crisis when the Ottoman fleet defected to Muhammad Ali and sailed to Alexandria. Before Mahmud could respond, he died in Istanbul after suffering from tuberculosis. His young son Abdülmecid inherited the throne at one of the most dangerous moments in Ottoman history. The army had been defeated, the fleet was no longer under government control, and the ruler of Egypt threatened to dismantle the empire from within. A group of senior officials concluded that military reform alone could not save the state. The empire required a deeper transformation of law, administration, finance, education, taxation, and the relationship between the government and its subjects. This reform movement became known as the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization. It represented an attempt to strengthen the central state by creating more predictable institutions and reducing arbitrary government. On the 3rd of November 1839, ministers, high officials, religious dignitaries, military officers, and foreign diplomats gathered in the Rose Garden of Topkapı Palace. There, Foreign Minister Mustafa Reşid Pasha publicly read a new imperial declaration known as the Gülhan Edict. The document promised security for the lives, honor, and property of all the Sultan's subjects. It declared that punishment should follow legal procedure and that officials should no longer confiscate property or impose penalties according to personal will. The edict also promised a regular system of taxation. Taxes were to be assessed through clearer rules rather than through arbitrary demands imposed by local governors, tax farmers, or powerful intermediaries. Military service was also to be reorganized. Conscription would follow a fairer and more predictable system, while limits would be placed on the length of service. The declaration condemned bribery and promised the introduction of new criminal laws. Officials would be held more accountable, and the government would attempt to establish a legal order that treated its subjects more consistently. Although the Gülhan Edict did not instantly create equality, it marked a major change in the language of Ottoman government. The state now claimed that all subjects possessed certain protections that could not legally be violated by officials. The reformers hoped that legal security would strengthen loyalty to the empire. By treating Muslims and non-Muslims more equally, they sought to weaken separatist movements and reduce the ability of European powers to intervene on behalf of Christian communities. Tanzimat reform also transformed education. Mahmud II had already established new secondary schools known as Rushdiyes. These institutions offered a more secular curriculum to boys who had completed traditional primary education. The purpose was highly practical. The expanding state needed officials who could read reports, manage budgets, conduct diplomacy, understand technical subjects, and administer new laws. Reformers wanted to create an educated bureaucratic class loyal to the central government. Yet they moved cautiously because religious scholars and conservative officials feared that modern schools would weaken Islamic education and traditional authority. To reduce opposition, many new institutions were attached to ministries or military departments rather than established as independent civilian schools. Medical and engineering education, for example, initially developed within the military system. These schools struggled with limited budgets, inadequate buildings, shortages of textbooks, and a lack of qualified instructors. Foreign teachers were sometimes employed, while students were sent abroad to acquire technical knowledge. Despite these problems, the educational reforms produced a new administrative elite. Over time, the Ottoman bureaucracy expanded dramatically and became several times larger than the older imperial administration. Graduates of modern schools entered ministries, provincial offices, diplomatic missions, courts, military institutions, and engineering departments. They developed a new bureaucratic culture based on written regulations, files, reports, examinations, and professional promotion. Financial reform was equally important. Without reliable revenue, no military, educational, or administrative program could succeed. The Tanzimat statesmen attempted to simplify tax collection and reduce the influence of intermediaries. Under the older system, provincial governors, tax farmers, local notables, and holders of various revenue grants had collected much of the empire's income. These intermediaries often kept large portions for themselves. The central treasury received less money, while peasants could be subjected to excessive or unpredictable demands. Reformers sought to replace this system with salaried government agents who would collect taxes directly. In theory, this would increase revenue, limit corruption, and protect taxpayers from abuse. In practice, the government lacked enough trained officials to control every province. Local elites remained powerful, records were incomplete, and communication between Istanbul and distant districts was slow. The reformers therefore had to compromise. New administrative structures were introduced, but many old practices continued beneath the surface. Foreign crises also repeatedly interrupted domestic reform. The first major issue remained Muhammad Ali of Egypt. Britain and the Ottoman government eventually combined diplomatic pressure with military action. In 1840, British and Ottoman naval forces attacked Egyptian positions along the eastern Mediterranean. Faced with European intervention and local resistance, Ibrahim Pasha withdrew from Syria and Palestine by early 1841. Muhammad Ali was forced to return most of his conquests. However, the Sultan recognized his family's hereditary right to govern Egypt. The province remained legally part of the Ottoman Empire, but it now operated as a virtually autonomous dynasty. The next great international challenge was the Crimean War. The immediate dispute involved Russia's growing claim to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. Russian rulers had long sought greater influence in the Balkans, the Danubian principalities, and the Black Sea. They presented themselves as defenders of Orthodox peoples living under Ottoman rule. Behind this religious language stood strategic ambition. Russia hoped to weaken both Ottoman and Austrian influence in southeastern Europe and create smaller states dependent on Russian support. Another dispute centered on Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Catholic and Orthodox clergy disagreed over rights of access and control, while France supported the Catholic claims and Russia defended the Orthodox position. In 1852, the Ottoman government issued a decision that largely favored the French-backed Catholic demands. The Tsar Nicholas I reacted angrily and increased pressure on Istanbul. Russia demanded formal recognition of its right to protect the Sultan's Orthodox subjects. Ottoman officials feared that accepting such a claim would give Russia permanent authority to interfere in the empire's internal affairs. Confident that Britain and France would not permit Russian domination of the Ottoman state, Istanbul rejected the demands. Russian forces then occupied Wallachia and Moldavia. In October 1853, the Ottoman Empire declared war. Initial fighting took place in the Balkans, eastern Anatolia, and the Black Sea. One of the war's most shocking events occurred at Sinop, where a Russian squadron attacked and destroyed an Ottoman naval force. Thousands of Ottoman sailors were killed, and much of the fleet was burned. The destruction at Sinop caused outrage in Britain and France. Both governments feared that Russia intended to dominate the Black Sea and perhaps threaten Istanbul itself. After diplomatic negotiations failed, Britain and France declared war on Russia in March 1854. Their intervention transformed the conflict from a regional confrontation into a major European war. Austria did not formally join the fighting, but its military pressure forced Russia to withdraw from Wallachia and Moldavia. The Allies then decided to attack the Russian naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea. The siege became the central campaign of the war. Disease, poor supply systems, severe weather, and incompetent leadership killed enormous numbers of soldiers on all sides. Sevastopol finally fell in 1855. Facing military exhaustion and diplomatic isolation, Russia agreed to negotiate peace. While representatives gathered in Paris, the Ottoman government issued another major reform declaration in February 1856. Known as the Hata Humayun, or Imperial Reform Edict, it expanded earlier promises of legal equality. The new decree confirmed that all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion, were to enjoy equal protection before the law. Non-Muslims were promised greater access to public office, state schools, and legal institutions. The government also repeated its commitment to reform taxation, military service, courts, provincial administration, and religious rights. European powers strongly encouraged these measures and regarded them as part of the diplomatic settlement. The Treaty of Paris was signed in March 1856. Russia withdrew from Wallachia and Moldavia, whose autonomy under nominal Ottoman sovereignty was confirmed along with that of Serbia. Russia also surrendered part of southern Bessarabia, reducing its direct access to the Danube. The river was open to international navigation. The Black Sea was neutralized, meaning that both Russia and the Ottoman Empire were prohibited from maintaining major naval forces or military arsenals there. Russia returned territories it had occupied in eastern Anatolia, including Kars. In exchange, the Allied powers evacuated Crimea and other Russian lands. The treaty formally admitted the Ottoman Empire into the European diplomatic system, commonly known as the Concert of Europe. Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the other signatories recognized the empire's territorial integrity and political independence. On paper, the settlement represented a diplomatic success. Russian expansion had been checked, and the Ottoman state received an international guarantee of protection. Yet this protection came with limitations. The empire had become increasingly dependent on European powers, whose governments now expected influence over Ottoman domestic policy. The war also created a severe financial burden. To pay for military expenses, the Ottoman government borrowed heavily from European banks. These were the empire's first large-scale foreign loans. They carried high interest rates and were often negotiated under unfavorable conditions. Borrowing initially allowed the government to finance the war and continue reform projects without immediately imposing heavier taxes. Over time, however, the debt accumulated faster than state revenue. A growing portion of the annual budget had to be devoted to interest payments. The government borrowed new money partly to repay earlier loans, creating a dangerous cycle of dependency. Foreign creditors gained increasing influence over Ottoman policy, while economic independence steadily weakened. Reformers wanted to build a stronger state, but the resources required for modernization were now tied to European financial institutions. The Tanzimat therefore produced a complex legacy. It created modern ministries, schools, courts, laws, and administrative practices. It also promoted a new idea of Ottoman citizenship that attempted to place Muslims and non-Muslims within a common political framework. At the same time, reform remained incomplete. Local resistance, religious tensions, nationalist movements, foreign intervention, financial weakness, and bureaucratic corruption limited its effectiveness. The Ottoman government was modernizing under extraordinary pressure. Every reform created new expectations, new expenses, and new opponents. The empire had entered the European state system, but not as an equal. Its survival increasingly depended on the balance of power among stronger countries, whose support was always connected to their own interests. The leaders of Tanzimat had prevented immediate collapse and transformed the institutions of government. They had not, however, solved the empire's deepest problems. Nationalism continued spreading through the Balkans. European powers continued interfering in Ottoman affairs. The treasury became increasingly dependent on foreign loans, while the gap between the ambitions of the reformers and the resources available to them continued to grow. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer simply fighting to recover lost territory. It was struggling to redefine the very foundations of imperial rule in a world dominated by nationalism, industrial power, modern armies, and international finance. The death of Grand Vizier Ali Pasha in September 1871 marked the end of an important chapter in Ottoman politics. As one of the leading architects of the Tanzimat reforms, his departure left a political vacuum that successive Grand Viziers struggled to fill. Sultan Abdulaziz gradually assumed greater control over daily state affairs, but instead of creating stability, His increasing personal involvement deepened divisions within the government and weakened the efficiency of the administration. Political dissatisfaction eventually reached a breaking point. In the early hours of May 30th, 1876, a coalition of senior officials and military commanders, led by the reform-minded Midhat Pasha, carried out a carefully organized coup without widespread violence. Abdulaziz was removed from the throne, and his nephew, Prince Murad, was proclaimed the new sultan. The transition was intended to restore confidence in the government and revive the reform movement that many believed had stalled during Abdulaziz's final years. Recognizing that the empire required a stable ruler during an increasingly dangerous international crisis, leading reformers removed Murad from power after only a brief reign. His younger brother ascended the throne as Sultan Abdulhamid II in August 1876. Later that year, Midhat Pasha became Grand Vizier and pushed forward one of the most ambitious political reforms in Ottoman history, the introduction of the empire's first written constitution. The new constitutional system raised hopes that representative government could strengthen the state and reduce foreign interference. These domestic reforms unfolded while the Balkans were descending into conflict. Serbia and Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire during the summer of 1876, encouraged by growing Russian support for Slavic nationalism. Although Ottoman forces succeeded in defeating the Serbian army, unrest continued to spread across the region. Soon afterward, an uprising erupted in Bulgaria. Ottoman troops suppressed the revolt with considerable force, resulting in large numbers of civilian casualties. Reports of these events attracted widespread attention across Europe and gave Russia an opportunity to present itself as the protector of the Balkan Christians. As tensions increased, the European powers sought a diplomatic solution. An international conference was convened in Istanbul in December 1876 with the goal of preventing another major war. On the very day the delegates gathered, the Ottoman government surprised them by announcing the promulgation of the new constitution. Ottoman representatives argued that equal citizenship and constitutional guarantees made additional foreign demands for reform unnecessary. While the declaration impressed many observers, it failed to remove the strategic rivalry between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. Inside the palace, political struggles continued to intensify. Abdulhamid II gradually lost confidence in Midhat Pasha and dismissed him early in 1877 before sending him into exile. Shortly afterward, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman resistance, particularly during the famous defense of Plevna, delayed the Russian advance for several months and demonstrated remarkable determination. Nevertheless, Russian forces eventually broke through Ottoman defenses and advanced to the outskirts of Constantinople, bringing the empire to the brink of disaster. The conflict ended with the Treaty of San Stefano in March 1878. Russia secured major territorial and political gains, including the creation of an enormous autonomous Bulgarian state stretching toward the Aegean Sea. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro received recognition as independent countries, while Russia acquired strategically important territories in the Caucasus. The Ottoman government also accepted obligations to implement reforms in several remaining provinces. The dramatic expansion of Russian influence alarmed Britain, Austria-Hungary, and the other European powers. To prevent Russia from dominating southeastern Europe, they gathered at the Congress of Berlin later that year. The resulting settlement reshaped the political map of the Balkans and significantly reduced Ottoman influence. Bulgaria was divided into separate political entities, preventing the emergence of a powerful Russian-aligned state. Bosnia-Herzegovina came under Austrian administration, Britain assumed control of Cyprus, and Russia retained important territories in the Caucasus. For the Ottoman Empire, the consequences were enormous. Millions of people were no longer subjects of the Sultan, and vast territories were permanently lost. Large numbers of Muslim refugees fled from the Balkans and the Caucasus into the empire's remaining provinces, creating new social and economic pressures. Although several Balkan nations achieved independence, few were satisfied with the final settlement. Competing territorial ambitions remained unresolved, leaving behind political tensions that continued to grow for decades. The Congress of Berlin did not establish lasting peace. Instead, it created a fragile balance in which almost every state believed it had been denied territory it deserved. Bulgarians resented the division of their lands, Serbians continued to dream of expansion, Romanians protested the loss of Bessarabia, Montenegro sought additional access to the Adriatic, and even Russia viewed the settlement as an incomplete reward for its costly military campaign. These unresolved disputes transformed the Balkans into one of Europe's most unstable regions, a situation that eventually contributed to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Despite the empire's military defeats and territorial losses, Abdülhamid II devoted considerable attention to modernization. He expanded elementary and secondary education, established new professional schools, strengthened medical training, and supported the growth of higher education in Istanbul. Modern communication networks also became a priority. Telegraph lines spread across the empire, while ambitious railway projects connected distant provinces more effectively than ever before. The completion of the Hejaz Railway greatly improved communication with the Arabian Peninsula and enabled the rapid deployment of troops to regions vulnerable to rebellion. Unlike many earlier reformers who admired European political models, Abdülhamid sought to combine modernization with the preservation of the empire's Islamic identity. As Christian populations declined following the loss of the Balkans, Muslims became the demographic majority within the empire. The Sultan increasingly emphasized his position as caliph and promoted the idea of Muslim unity across the Islamic world. Pan-Islamism became not only a religious message but also a political strategy designed to reinforce loyalty to the Ottoman state while resisting growing European imperial influence. Even with these reforms, the empire continued to shrink. France established control over Tunisia in 1881, Britain occupied Egypt the following year, and Greece steadily expanded its territory. Crete eventually gained autonomous status before becoming part of Greece in the early 20th century. Throughout Abdülhamid's reign, the Ottoman Empire struggled to balance modernization, internal stability, and resistance to foreign pressure. Although many reforms strengthened state institutions, they could not reverse the powerful nationalist movements and international rivalries that were steadily dismantling one of the world's oldest empires. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire found itself facing challenges unlike any it had experienced before. Although Sultan Abdülhamid II had invested considerable effort in strengthening the state through educational reforms, military modernization, and improved infrastructure, these measures failed to eliminate growing political dissatisfaction. In fact, many of the empire's newly educated citizens became its strongest critics. Officers trained in modern military academies, university graduates, government officials, journalists, and intellectuals increasingly believed that meaningful reform could no longer come from absolute rule alone. Instead, they argued that the future of the empire depended on reviving constitutional government and restoring political participation through an elected parliament. These ideas gradually spread through secret political circles that began appearing during the late 1880s. Small groups of reform-minded students and officers met discreetly to exchange ideas, discuss the empire's future, and organize resistance against the existing political system. Some members eventually fled abroad to avoid arrest, settling in European cities where they established newspapers and political organizations dedicated to criticizing the Sultan's increasingly centralized authority. Those who remained inside the empire focused their attention on military units stationed in Macedonia and other strategically important regions, quietly recruiting supporters among younger officers. Over time, these scattered organizations developed into a broader political movement that became widely known as the Young Turks. At its center stood the Committee of Union and Progress, an organization determined to reshape the Ottoman political system rather than simply replace individual leaders. The opportunity they had been waiting for arrived unexpectedly during the summer of 1908. Macedonia had become one of the empire's most unstable provinces, where nationalist unrest, foreign intervention, and military frustration created an atmosphere ripe for rebellion. Officers sympathetic to the Committee of Union and Progress openly defied the government and demanded the immediate restoration of the constitution that had remained suspended for decades. As additional military units declared their support, it became increasingly clear that suppressing the revolt would risk dividing the Ottoman army itself. Faced with mounting pressure and uncertain loyalty among his own forces, Abdülhamid II decided that compromise offered the safest course. Rather than ordering a prolonged military confrontation, he announced the restoration of constitutional government in July 1908 and authorized elections for a new parliament. Across the empire, the decision was greeted with scenes of extraordinary celebration. In Istanbul, crowds filled the streets as Muslims, Christians, and Jews embraced one another, believing that a new political era had begun. Optimism spread rapidly throughout the provinces, as many citizens hoped constitutional rule would overcome decades of political tension and strengthen the unity of the empire. When the new parliament convened later that year, representatives from numerous ethnic and religious communities took their seats, reflecting the remarkable diversity that still existed within the Ottoman state. Despite this wave of enthusiasm, international developments quickly exposed the limits of the revolution. Many young Turk leaders believed that constitutional reform would convince Europe's great powers to respect Ottoman sovereignty. Reality proved far different. Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria declared complete independence while incorporating Eastern Rumelia, and Greece tightened its control over Crete. Instead of rewarding reform, the European powers took advantage of the empire's political transition to advance their own strategic interests. The revolution had transformed Ottoman politics, but it had done little to halt the steady loss of imperial territory. The following year brought another serious crisis. Supporters of Abdülhamid attempted to reverse the constitutional movement through an uprising in Istanbul, hoping to restore the previous political order. Their effort collapsed after loyal army units marched on the capital and re-established control. Parliament responded decisively by removing Abdülhamid II from the throne and replacing him with his brother, Mehmed V. Although the Ottoman monarchy survived, political authority no longer rested primarily inside the palace. Increasingly, real influence belonged to military commanders, senior bureaucrats, and the leadership of the Committee of Union and Progress, whose role within the government continued to expand. Yet replacing one political system with another did not solve the empire's growing difficulties. Rival factions competed for influence, ideological disagreements divided reformers, and provincial unrest continued to challenge central authority. Revolts erupted in Albania, resistance intensified in Yemen, and Italy launched an invasion of the Ottoman provinces in North Africa. Unable to defend Libya effectively while confronting threats elsewhere, the government eventually accepted defeat. The loss of another province further weakened confidence in the empire's ability to protect its remaining territories, and encouraged neighboring Balkan states to believe that the Ottoman military had entered a period of irreversible decline. The Ottoman Empire developed a social order that clearly separated those who governed from those who were governed. At the top stood the ruling elite, a privileged class composed of soldiers, high-ranking administrators, religious scholars, and senior officials who managed the affairs of the state. Alongside them, the leaders of recognized non-Muslim religious communities also held important administrative responsibilities within their own populations. Beneath this governing class lived the vast majority of the empire's inhabitants, including farmers, craftsmen, merchants, nomadic tribes, and traders. These communities produced food, manufactured goods, maintained commercial networks, and generated the taxes that financed both the government and the military. Rural farmers formed the backbone of the empire because settled agriculture provided a stable tax base and a dependable source of recruits for the army. Nomadic groups, although valuable as warriors and herders, often resisted central authority, leading successive Ottoman governments to encourage or compel them to adopt a settled lifestyle. The political system revolved around the Sultan, whose authority united executive, military, and judicial power. He was regarded as the legitimate ruler of the empire and the ultimate guardian of justice, responsible for protecting both the state and its people. Although his authority was immense, it was not considered unlimited. Islamic law, long-established customs, and the influence of respected religious scholars acted as important restraints on arbitrary rule. The legitimacy of the Ottoman monarchy therefore rested not only on military strength, but also on the expectation that the ruler would govern fairly and preserve social order. During the empire's earliest centuries, Ottoman government remained closely connected to military expansion. The first rulers personally led campaigns, inspected frontier territories, and spent much of their lives moving between fortified strongholds. Rather than ruling permanently from a magnificent capital, they governed as warrior kings whose authority depended on successful leadership in battle. Military victories expanded Ottoman territory, while conquered lands and captured wealth strengthened the state's growing institutions. As the empire expanded into southeastern Europe and Anatolia, this mobile frontier principality gradually transformed into one of the largest imperial powers of the early modern world. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 marked a decisive turning point in Ottoman history. With the establishment of the city as the imperial capital, the sultans adopted a more permanent seat of government. Soon afterward, Mehmed II commissioned the construction of Topkapi Palace on the commanding heights overlooking the Bosphorus. More than simply a royal residence, the palace became the political heart of the empire for centuries. It functioned as the residence of the Sultan, the headquarters of the imperial administration, the home of thousands of officials and servants, and the location where crucial political decisions affecting 3 continents were made. Topkapi Palace was carefully organized into successive courtyards, each serving a distinct purpose. The outer sections handled administrative business, military affairs, and public ceremonies, while deeper sections became increasingly restricted. Only trusted officials received permission to enter the innermost areas, where the Sultan lived and worked. Government ministers met to discuss state affairs before presenting their decisions to the ruler, while palace schools educated carefully selected young men who would later become governors, generals, diplomats, and senior administrators. Through this highly structured environment, the palace produced many of the officials responsible for governing the empire during its most powerful centuries. Among the palace's most famous sections was the imperial harem. Popular imagination often portrays it merely as a luxurious private residence, yet it also served as an important political institution. The Sultan's mother, wives, children, attendants, and servants lived within this protected complex, where influence over succession, education, and court politics could shape imperial decision-making. The Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother, frequently became one of the most influential figures in the empire, especially when a young or inexperienced sultan occupied the throne. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire sought to present itself as a modern European power while preserving its imperial traditions. This ambition was reflected in the construction of Dolmabahce Palace along the Bosphorus. Unlike the medieval character of Topkapi, the new residence embraced grand European architectural styles, featuring monumental halls, richly decorated reception rooms, elegant staircases, and luxurious private apartments. It became the principal residence of the Sultan and the center of official ceremonies, diplomatic receptions, and state functions, symbolizing an empire attempting to balance modernization with its own historical identity. Later, Sultan Abdulhamid II transferred the royal residence once again, this time to Yildiz Palace. Built within extensive gardens overlooking Istanbul, the complex combined administrative buildings, workshops, theaters, residential quarters, and reception halls into a secure governmental center. The Sultan preferred the relative privacy and security of this palace, directing many state affairs from its offices while receiving foreign diplomats in specially designated reception areas. Within the surrounding gardens, members of the imperial family enjoyed a quieter life away from the formal ceremonies that had characterized earlier palaces. These changing residences reflected the broader transformation of the Ottoman Empire itself. What had begun as a frontier principality led by warrior rulers gradually evolved into a sophisticated imperial state with an elaborate bureaucracy, permanent institutions, and monumental architecture. Throughout this evolution, the empire remained centered on a powerful monarchy supported by administrators, soldiers, scholars, merchants, and millions of ordinary subjects whose labor sustained one of history's longest-lasting empires. This complex social structure, together with its administrative institutions and magnificent palaces, formed the foundation upon which Ottoman rule endured for more than 6 centuries. In European literature, paintings, and travel accounts, the Ottoman harem was often portrayed as a mysterious world filled with unchecked luxury, endless pleasure, and ruthless violence. Writers imagined the Sultan as an absolute despot surrounded by countless women who existed solely for his personal enjoyment, while the women themselves were depicted as powerless captives with no influence over their own lives. These dramatic images became deeply rooted in the Western imagination and helped shape a lasting stereotype of Ottoman society. Yet visitors who actually entered the empire frequently discovered that these fantasies had little connection to reality. Although Islamic law permitted a man to marry more than one wife under certain conditions, polygamy was never common among the general population. The overwhelming majority of Ottoman families consisted of a single husband and wife, while maintaining several wives required enormous wealth that very few people possessed. By the late Ottoman period, the practice had become increasingly uncommon, and with the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, it disappeared entirely from the country's legal system. Within the imperial palace, the harem was far more than a place of private life. It formed one of the most carefully organized institutions of the Ottoman court and functioned as the residence of the Sultan and his family. Containing hundreds of rooms, kitchens, baths, schools, courtyards, and service buildings, it operated almost like a self-contained city hidden behind the palace walls. Access was tightly regulated, and every resident occupied a clearly defined place within a strict hierarchy that governed daily routines and responsibilities. The highest-ranking woman inside this world was the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. Her authority extended well beyond household affairs. She supervised the organization of the imperial household, directed large numbers of servants, and often exercised considerable political influence through her close relationship with her son. During periods when inexperienced rulers occupied the throne, the Queen Mother could become one of the most influential individuals in the empire, advising on appointments, mediating disputes, and shaping important political decisions behind the scenes. Many of the women who entered the imperial household originally came from the Caucasus, particularly regions such as Circassia, Georgia, and Abkhazia, while others arrived through diplomatic gifts or the slave trade that existed across parts of the early modern world. Once inside the palace, they received years of education rather than immediately becoming members of the Sultan's household. They studied language, religion, etiquette, music, embroidery, household administration, and court protocol. Only a small number eventually became companions of the ruler, while many others served in administrative or domestic roles throughout the palace. Advancement depended on discipline, education, and loyalty rather than simple beauty. The security of the harem rested largely in the hands of eunuchs, who occupied unique positions within the Ottoman court. Since Islamic law prohibited Muslims from performing castration, eunuchs were generally acquired through external slave markets before entering Ottoman service. Two principal groups served in the palace. Black eunuchs, many originating from northeastern Africa, supervised the imperial harem and protected the women of the royal family. White eunuchs, many from the Balkans and the Caucasus, were responsible for sections of the palace connected with education and administration, particularly the training of promising young recruits destined for government service. Among these officials, none held greater influence than the chief black eunuch. His responsibilities extended well beyond guarding the harem. He coordinated palace administration, supervised religious charitable foundations connected to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, oversaw the education of the crown prince, and maintained constant access to the Sultan and the Queen Mother. Because he stood at the intersection of the royal household and the imperial government, he often became one of the most powerful figures in Ottoman politics, with influence rivaling that of senior ministers. The palace itself functioned through an elaborate administrative structure designed to meet every need of the ruler. Different chambers managed personal security, finances, ceremonial objects, meals, clothing, correspondence, and preparations for military campaigns. Young pages selected for palace service underwent years of education and practical training before receiving positions close to the Sultan. Those who demonstrated exceptional intelligence, discipline, and loyalty frequently rose to become governors, generals, diplomats, or grand viziers, making the palace one of the empire's most important training centers for future leaders. As the Ottoman court became increasingly formal, direct access to the Sultan grew more restricted. Layers of attendants, pages, secretaries, and senior officials stood between the ruler and the outside world. This gradual isolation unintentionally strengthened the political importance of the imperial household. The Queen Mother, influential wives, trusted attendants, and senior eunuchs often became essential channels through which information reached the monarch. Their privileged access allowed them to influence appointments, communicate political concerns, and occasionally shape the direction of imperial policy. Despite popular legends portraying Ottoman rulers as idle monarchs consumed by luxury, many sultans followed disciplined daily routines. Their mornings were usually devoted to government business, including meetings with ministers, reviewing reports, issuing decrees, and hearing petitions. Afternoons often involved military inspections, administrative discussions, or private study. Evenings varied according to the personality of the ruler. Some invited scholars to debate theology and law, others welcomed poets, musicians, historians, or storytellers, while religious gatherings, artistic performances, and literary discussions formed regular parts of palace life. Hunting, horseback riding, and military exercises also remained favorite pursuits whenever circumstances allowed. Court life evolved significantly during the 19th century as the empire embraced administrative modernization and greater contact with Europe. Ceremonial traditions that had defined earlier centuries gradually gave way to a more informal style of government. Sultan Abdulhamid II, for example, adopted a routine that reflected both Ottoman tradition and European influence. He began his day early, worked closely with his secretaries, met government officials throughout the afternoon, and received foreign diplomats in a far less ceremonial atmosphere than his predecessors. Formal audiences increasingly resembled diplomatic conversations rather than elaborate court rituals. Although interpreters were often necessary during discussions with foreign representatives, the Sultan remained personally involved in state affairs, carefully reviewing reports before making important decisions. Outside official duties, Abdulhamid preferred a quieter private life. He enjoyed spending time with his family, listening to and performing music, taking walks through the gardens of Yildiz Palace, or relaxing beside its artificial lake. Unlike the extravagant image often presented abroad, his daily routine reflected a ruler balancing political responsibilities with personal interests while attempting to preserve an empire facing mounting internal pressures and international challenges. Through its palaces, court officials, educational institutions, and carefully structured household, the Ottoman dynasty maintained a sophisticated system of government that combined ceremonial tradition with practical administration for centuries. Public displays of the Ottoman Sultan were rare, making every appearance an important political event. One of the few occasions when ordinary people could see their ruler was the weekly Friday procession to the imperial mosque for communal prayer. These journeys were carefully choreographed to reinforce the dignity of the throne and the authority of the state. Court officials, military commanders, palace servants, and elite guards accompanied the Sultan according to a strict order that reflected their rank within the imperial hierarchy. Every detail, from the clothing of the attendants to the formation of the escort, was intended to communicate discipline, stability, and power to the thousands who gathered along the streets to witness the procession. Military expeditions offered another opportunity for the empire to display its strength before both its own population and foreign observers. Before an army departed, leading officials gathered to finalize strategy, organize logistics, and receive the ruler's final instructions. Once preparations were complete, the Grand Vizier assumed operational command and led the expedition while the Sultan symbolically entrusted him with the responsibility of carrying out the campaign. The departure itself became a public spectacle. Citizens crowded the streets, rooftops, and waterfronts to cheer the soldiers as they marched toward their destination. If the army crossed from Europe into Asia, fleets of boats transported thousands of men, horses, weapons, and supplies across the Bosphorus, while the imperial court watched from the palace overlooking the strait. Foreign travelers were often astonished by the scale and organization of these military parades. Long columns of standard-bearers carrying brightly colored banners announced the beginning of the procession. Palace officials, messengers, artillery units, armored infantry, cavalry regiments, engineers, and elite formations followed one another in carefully arranged order. Janissaries marched in disciplined ranks while musicians, drummers, and members of religious brotherhoods accompanied them with prayers and ceremonial music. Senior judges, religious scholars, provincial governors, ministers, and high-ranking officers appeared near the end of the procession before the arrival of the Grand Vizier himself, whose richly decorated entourage symbolized the authority delegated to him by the Sultan. Behind him came additional cavalry and bodyguards, completing a procession that could continue for hours before the final units disappeared from view. The Ottoman court also transformed civic celebrations into demonstrations of imperial unity. Before some campaigns, the craft and trade guilds of Istanbul were instructed to organize elaborate public festivals. These events showcased the remarkable diversity of urban life while emphasizing that every profession contributed to the strength of the empire. Bakers, blacksmiths, jewelers, tailors, carpenters, merchants, and countless other craftsmen paraded through the streets in distinctive clothing representing their occupations. Many groups constructed elaborate moving displays that illustrated their daily work. Bakers prepared bread before cheering spectators, millers demonstrated grinding grain, farmers acted out the sowing and harvesting of crops, and artisans displayed the tools and products that sustained the economy. Musicians, dancers, storytellers, comedians, and performers entertained enormous crowds, turning the city into a festival that often lasted several days. The processions reflected not only economic life, but also the empire's social order. Prestigious guilds usually appeared near the front, while occupations considered less respectable marched later in the parade. Even marginal professions sometimes participated under official supervision, illustrating the state's desire to include every segment of urban society within the ceremonial display. Commerce largely paused during these celebrations as residents abandoned their daily routines to witness the spectacle. Beyond entertainment, these festivals reminded the population that every profession ultimately served the empire and its ruler, reinforcing loyalty while strengthening civic identity. Such ceremonies continued well into the 18th century. Armies preparing for campaigns still marched before the court in lengthy processions that combined military discipline with theatrical performance. Religious figures opened many of these events by reciting passages from the Quran, followed by symbolic scenes representing agriculture, food production, craftsmanship, and commerce. Decorated wagons carried mills, ovens, workshops, and other displays illustrating the occupations that sustained the empire during both war and peace. Guild members marched proudly behind these displays while distributing bread, pastries, or small gifts to the crowds, creating an atmosphere that blended religious devotion, civic celebration, and political symbolism. Victorious armies returned with equally dramatic ceremonies. Captured banners, enemy weapons, prisoners of war, and other trophies were displayed before enormous crowds as tangible evidence of imperial success. These triumphal entries celebrated military achievement while reassuring the population that the empire remained capable of defending its frontiers. Festivities often continued for days, accompanied by music, feasting, public performances, and official announcements celebrating the achievements of the campaign. Members of the imperial family, particularly the women of the palace, generally remained secluded from public life. Yet exceptional celebrations sometimes included arrangements that allowed them to observe important events from specially prepared viewing areas. Royal weddings, the circumcision ceremonies of princes, victories in war, and other dynastic occasions became opportunities for magnificent state festivals that united the palace with the people of the capital. Markets flourished, entertainers performed before enormous audiences, and artisans displayed the finest examples of their work. These celebrations projected an image of prosperity, stability, and imperial grandeur while temporarily easing the pressures of everyday life. Dynastic festivals gradually became one of the defining traditions of Ottoman court culture. They celebrated the continuity of the ruling family while providing the government with an opportunity to strengthen public loyalty during periods of success as well as times of political uncertainty. Poets, historians, and court writers carefully recorded many of these events in richly illustrated festival books, preserving detailed accounts of the ceremonies, performances, and public celebrations that marked some of the most important moments in Ottoman history. Ottoman rulers understood that public ceremony could be used as a powerful instrument of government. Among the most spectacular occasions were the circumcision festivals organized for imperial princes. These celebrations could last for several weeks and often included not only members of the royal family, but also large numbers of boys from across the capital. The event therefore combined dynastic ritual with public participation, turning a private family ceremony into a vast imperial festival. Throughout the celebrations, Istanbul was transformed. The city was illuminated with lamps and torches, public buildings were decorated, and the waters of the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus became stages for brightly lit boats, musical performances, and elaborate displays. Foreign entertainers, unusual animals, acrobats, dancers, musicians, and theatrical performers added an international character to the festivities. Mock battles, fireworks, contests, banquets, and public sacrifices created an atmosphere in which religion, spectacle, and politics blended together. One of the most distinctive objects carried during these ceremonies was the nahil, a tall wooden structure shaped like a pyramid and covered with flowers, fruit, leaves, wax ornaments, and images of birds and animals. Its form symbolized fertility, renewal, and the continuation of the dynasty. Musicians, soldiers, artisans, and performers accompanied it through the streets before it was placed near the prince who was to be circumcised. After the ceremony, it was carried back to the palace. Along the route, sweet drinks, pastries, and food were distributed to the crowd, while sheep were sacrificed and large meals were prepared for guests, officials, soldiers, and ordinary residents of the city. Hundreds of performers took part in these festivals. Singers, dancers, comedians, jugglers, fire eaters, mimics, acrobats, and musicians competed to attract the attention of the Sultan and the public. Many came from the Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Roma communities of the empire. The best-known performers could receive generous rewards, and their success depended on producing the most entertaining, surprising, or humorous spectacle. In this way, imperial celebrations created a temporary world in which ordinary rules were relaxed and the streets became a vast public theater. The appointment of a Grand Vizier could also become a ceremonial occasion. Astrologers sometimes selected the most favorable hour for his formal entrance into the capital, while spectators rented shops or balconies along the route to watch the procession. On reaching the palace, the new chief minister received a ceremonial robe, jeweled decorations, and the blessing of the Sultan. Animals were sacrificed, food was distributed to the poor, and money or gifts were given to military units to ensure their support. The ceremony made clear that the Grand Vizier's authority came directly from the ruler. The Grand Vizier was the highest official in the Ottoman government and acted as the Sultan's chief deputy. He supervised the daily administration of the empire, appointed many central and provincial officials, coordinated military affairs, and presided over the imperial council. From the 17th century onward, his official residence became known as the Sublime Porte, a name that gradually came to represent the Ottoman government itself. The imperial council brought together the most powerful administrators of the empire. It included senior viziers, the chief officials of the treasury, leading judges, military commanders, and the head of the chancery responsible for preparing official decrees and applying the imperial seal. The commanders of the janissaries and the cavalry could attend, while the Grand Admiral represented the navy. Large numbers of scribes, messengers, guards, and clerks supported the work of the council and ensured that decisions were recorded and transmitted throughout the provinces. Members of the council arrived at the palace with impressive entourages that reflected their rank and prestige. Senior officials maintained large households of servants, guards, secretaries, messengers, and advisors. When the council assembled, each man sat according to his position in the official hierarchy. The Grand Vizier occupied the central place, with judges, treasurers, chancery officials, and scribes arranged around him. The strict seating order reflected the highly organized nature of Ottoman administration. In the earlier centuries, the Sultan personally attended meetings of the Imperial Council. As the empire expanded and court ceremony became more formal, he gradually withdrew from direct participation. Instead, he could listen to the debates through a concealed window overlooking the council chamber. This allowed him to follow the discussions without appearing before the ministers and reminded them that their ruler might be observing them at any moment. The council dealt with nearly every major matter of state. It received foreign ambassadors, planned military campaigns, supervised the supply of armies, ordered the construction of fortresses and public works, appointed officials, examined reports from governors, and responded to petitions from the provinces. It also acted as a high court. Both members of the ruling class and ordinary subjects could bring complaints before the Grand Vizier, who listened to cases and issued judgments. Petitioners presented their own arguments without lawyers, and even poor subjects could seek justice against powerful officials. Meetings often lasted for many hours and included several meals. When food was served, senior officials gathered around large copper trays and shared dishes prepared in the palace kitchens. Meals included bread, rice, soups, poultry, lamb, mutton, sauces, sherbets, and water. The dishes were brought in succession, with each plate removed after the officials had tasted it. Leftover food was distributed among their servants and attendants, whose meals were generally simpler. After the council completed its work, the Grand Vizier and selected ministers sometimes entered the Sultan's audience chamber to present reports. The Grand Vizier spoke directly to the ruler, while most other officials stood silently with their hands crossed and heads lowered. The ceremony emphasized both obedience to the Sultan and the enormous authority entrusted to the Grand Vizier. Foreign diplomacy followed an equally formal system. Ambassadors visiting the palace were escorted by elite cavalry and government officials. Before meeting the Sultan, they were received by the Grand Vizier and served an elaborate meal, usually followed by coffee and sweets. They were then led to the audience chamber by senior palace officials. There, the ambassador approached the throne, bowed, and symbolically kissed a strip of cloth hanging from the Sultan's sleeve. During the height of Ottoman power, the ruler remained seated and did not permit foreign envoys to sit in his presence. This behavior was intended to demonstrate that the ambassador had entered the court of a sovereign who regarded himself as the equal or superior of other monarchs. By the 19th century, Ottoman diplomatic customs had become less rigid, and sultans increasingly stood to greet foreign representatives in a more European manner. The Ottoman government remained relatively small when compared with the administrative systems of modern states. Its principal responsibilities were defending the empire, maintaining public order, collecting revenue, supplying the army, administering justice, and ensuring that the capital received food and other essential goods. Education, medical assistance, charity, and social welfare were often managed by religious communities, guilds, and charitable foundations rather than directly by the central government. Despite its limited size, the Ottoman administrative system governed a vast and diverse territory for centuries. Through ceremonies, councils, petitions, military organization, and carefully structured offices, the empire connected the authority of the Sultan to the daily administration of distant provinces. Public festivals displayed the magnificence of the dynasty, while the imperial council transformed royal authority into practical decisions. Together, ceremony and administration formed two essential pillars of Ottoman government. For centuries, the Ottoman state relied on a carefully trained administrative and military elite whose members often began life far from the imperial court. Many governors, commanders, and senior officials were recruited when they were still boys, brought into the service of the Sultan, converted to Islam, and educated within institutions controlled by the palace. This system, known as the devshirme, drew primarily from Christian communities in the European provinces of the empire. Its purpose was to create servants whose position, education, and future depended entirely on the ruler, rather than on powerful local families. Recruiters periodically visited towns and villages in the Balkans and selected boys considered healthy, intelligent, disciplined, and physically capable. The chosen recruits were registered and transported in groups to the Ottoman capital. There, they entered a demanding system of education and training. The most promising were assigned to palace schools, while others were prepared for service in the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry force maintained and paid directly by the central treasury. Life inside the palace was designed to separate these boys from their previous environment and reshape them into members of the Ottoman ruling class. Their education began with discipline, silence, posture, and court etiquette. They learned how to behave in the presence of the Sultan, when to speak, where to stand, and how to demonstrate loyalty and respect. They studied reading and writing, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, religion, literature, and the refined language used by the administrative elite. Physical education was equally important. Riding, archery, wrestling, spear throwing, swordsmanship, and other military skills formed part of their daily routine. The palace sought to create men who could serve equally well in government or war. Those who completed their training successfully might remain close to the ruler, enter the central administration, command military units, or later govern distant provinces. For much of the classical period, they were expected to remain unmarried until relatively late in life so that their loyalty and energy would be directed toward the Sultan rather than toward their own households. In the earliest Ottoman period, slave recruits had mainly served as soldiers, while many administrative positions were occupied by members of established Muslim families educated in law, theology, and bureaucratic practice. This balance began to change under Mehmed II. Determined to reduce the political influence of hereditary elites, he increasingly appointed palace-trained servants to the most powerful offices of state. As a result, men who had entered Ottoman service as young captives could rise to become commanders, governors, ministers, and even grand viziers. The Janissaries were the most famous military product of this system. Originally organized as a permanent infantry force directly loyal to the ruler, they differed from provincial cavalry because they received regular salaries from the treasury and lived under strict discipline. Their training, organization, and use of firearms made them one of the most effective military forces of the early modern period. They also performed duties within Istanbul, helping maintain security and public order in districts where their units were stationed. Over time, however, the character of the corps changed. During the 17th century, discipline weakened and military effectiveness declined. Janissary commanders became increasingly involved in palace politics, and the force that had once protected the ruler began to influence the selection and removal of sultans. Their presence in the capital gave them enormous political power, and repeated rebellions demonstrated that the government could no longer control them as easily as before. Economic pressures accelerated this transformation. Inflation reduced the real value of their salaries, while delays in payment encouraged many janissaries to seek other sources of income. They entered commerce, opened coffee houses, worked as craftsmen, boatmen, bakers, butchers, and porters, or formed relationships with urban guilds and shopkeepers. Some offered protection in return for regular payments. They increasingly married, lived outside their barracks, and arranged for their sons to enter the corps, turning what had once been a merit-based military institution into something closer to a hereditary social group. Because their economic interests became tied to the traditional urban order, the Janissaries often opposed military and administrative reform. Any attempt to establish a new army trained according to European methods threatened their income, prestige, and political influence. By the early 19th century, they had become one of the greatest obstacles facing reform-minded rulers. Sultan Mahmud II finally moved against them in 1826. After provoking and suppressing their resistance, government forces attacked the Janissary barracks in Istanbul and destroyed the corps. The event ended an institution that had shaped Ottoman military and political life for centuries. Yet abolishing the Janissaries did not immediately solve the empire's military weaknesses. Building a disciplined and modern army required decades of reform, foreign expertise, and painful experience in wars against European powers. Beyond the capital, Ottoman survival depended on an effective provincial system capable of collecting taxes, maintaining order, and supplying soldiers. Land formed the foundation of this system. Most agricultural territory was considered state property, although private holdings and religious endowments also existed. Peasants usually possessed hereditary rights to cultivate their fields, but they did not enjoy complete freedom to sell or transfer them without official approval. The government constantly sought to preserve agricultural production because farming supported both taxation and military organization. When new territory was conquered, officials surveyed villages, fields, crops, and other taxable resources. Their findings were entered into detailed registers, which allowed the state to estimate revenue and assign obligations. These surveys were revised periodically to account for changes in population, cultivation, and productivity. Because coin was often scarce, the government could not always pay soldiers and officials directly from the treasury. Instead, it assigned them the right to collect revenue from particular districts. The most common of these assignments was the timar. A cavalryman known as a sipahi received income from the land in return for military service. He did not own the territory, but collected taxes, maintained local order, protected agricultural production, and joined imperial campaigns with armed retainers. Larger revenue assignments were known as ziamats and were generally granted to more important officers. The value of the assignment determined the number of soldiers its holder was expected to provide during war. This arrangement allowed the government to maintain a large cavalry force without paying every man directly from Istanbul. The sipahi lived closer to rural society than the salaried soldiers of the capital. He collected part of the harvest or other dues from the peasants and converted these goods into usable income. In return, he was expected to prevent violence, protect cultivation, and ensure that taxes reached the state. His authority was limited by law and administrative custom, since the land ultimately remained under imperial control. Several timars were grouped within a larger district known as a sancak. Each sancak was governed by a sancak bey, a military administrator who received a banner from the sultan as a symbol of delegated authority. Beneath him served other officers responsible for organizing cavalry, enforcing government orders, arresting criminals, and preserving peace. Through this combination of palace education, salaried infantry, provincial cavalry, taxation, and land administration, the Ottoman Empire created a system capable of ruling vast territories with a relatively small central bureaucracy. Its strength rested on the loyalty of trained servants, the productivity of peasant agriculture, and the ability to convert local revenue into military power. For centuries, these institutions helped connect the authority of the Sultan in Istanbul with distant villages, towns, and frontiers across the empire. As the Ottoman Empire expanded across vast territories, its provincial administration became increasingly complex. The number of districts grew, and the central government needed a stronger system to supervise local officials. For this reason, several sancaks were grouped into larger provinces under the authority of a beylebey, a senior governor whose title literally meant Bey of the Beys. From his provincial capital, the beylebey supervised district governors, coordinated military preparations, collected information about taxes, and represented the authority of the sultan. These provincial capitals usually contained a permanent military garrison, a religious judge, treasury officials, and administrators responsible for taxation. Yet, the empire did not apply the same model everywhere. Ottoman rule was flexible and often adapted to local traditions. In many Kurdish and Arab regions, tribal leaders were recognized as hereditary governors. They collected taxes, retained part of the revenue, and supplied soldiers when the sultan went to war. Their loyalty mattered more than direct administration from Istanbul. Some territories remained under their own Christian or Muslim rulers while acknowledging Ottoman supremacy. Wallachia and Moldavia were governed by native princes, while the Crimean Khanate preserved its own dynasty. These rulers paid annual tribute, supported Ottoman military campaigns, and were expected to regard the enemies of the Sultan as their own enemies. At times, one of the ruler's sons was sent to the Ottoman court as a guarantee of obedience. Such arrangements allowed the empire to control distant regions without replacing every local institution. Alongside governors stood the Qadi, the judge who represented the legal authority of the Sultan. Provincial governors possessed executive and military power, but they could not lawfully punish or confiscate property without a judicial decision. The Qadi, meanwhile, could issue judgments, but depended on the governor and local officers to enforce them. This separation created a balance between administrative authority and legal oversight. The duties of a Qadi extended far beyond criminal trials. He resolved disputes, registered contracts, supervised inheritances, protected the property of orphans, recorded marriages, and performed many of the functions associated with a modern notary. In reaching decisions, he applied Islamic law, imperial regulations, and, when appropriate, established local customs. The Ottoman legal system therefore combined religious principles with practical rules designed to meet the needs of a diverse empire. Penalties varied according to the seriousness of the offense. Crimes such as murder, rape, and armed robbery could result in execution or severe physical punishment. Lesser offenses, including assault, theft, drinking alcohol, or adultery, were often punished through fines or corporal penalties. In practice, local circumstances, evidence, social status, and the judgment of the court could all influence the outcome. Most Ottoman subjects belonged to one of three broad productive groups: farmers, craftsmen, or merchants. Together they supplied food, manufactured goods, maintained commercial networks, and generated the revenue that supported the government. Ottoman cities were among the most important economic and cultural centers of the early modern world. Their skylines were shaped by mosques, churches, synagogues, schools, markets, bathhouses, fountains, bridges, mausoleums, and charitable complexes. Many cities had existed since antiquity, while others developed along military roads, caravan routes, ports, and border zones. These towns connected rural villages to major markets and served as administrative centers for the surrounding countryside. Although they were often physically compact, their narrow streets contained a dense mixture of houses, workshops, religious buildings, coffee houses, inns, gardens, fountains, and public baths. The basic social unit of the Ottoman city was the mahal, or neighborhood. A mahal was more than a geographical district. It formed a closely connected social world in which people shared religious institutions, local markets, public services, and daily routines. Most residents spent much of their lives within their immediate neighborhood because nearly everything they needed could be found nearby. A typical mahal contained a place of worship, small shops, food sellers, fountains, and sometimes a bathhouse or school. The constant contact among neighbors created a strong sense of belonging. Residents knew one another's families, occupations, and habits. Strangers were noticed immediately, and local solidarity could provide protection during illness, poverty, or crisis. Yet the same closeness also encouraged gossip, suspicion, and social pressure. Neighborhoods often developed around religion or occupation. Muslim districts usually centered on a mosque, Christian quarters around a church, and Jewish neighborhoods around a synagogue. Some were named after the dominant craft practiced there, such as weaving, metalworking, leather production, or food preparation. The house of worship served as the spiritual and social center of the community. Each mahale had recognized representatives. In Muslim neighborhoods, the imam served as the religious leader, while another local official acted as the link between the community and the government. Christian and Jewish quarters were represented by priests, rabbis, elders, or other communal figures. These leaders helped communicate official orders, settle minor disputes, identify residents, and collect taxes. Smaller Ottoman towns followed a similar pattern. Their centers usually contained the main mosque, administrative buildings, markets, inns, bathhouses, schools, and Sufi lodges. Commercial life was concentrated in the central district, while residential neighborhoods spread outward. Muslim officials and craftsmen often lived closer to the center, while Christian communities were sometimes located in surrounding quarters. Merchants from Greek, Armenian, Jewish, Balkan, and foreign communities played especially important roles in regional and international trade. The outer neighborhoods of Balkan towns were often highly diverse. Bulgarians, Greeks, Armenians, Albanians, Jews, and merchants from the Adriatic coast might live within the same urban area while maintaining their own religious and communal institutions. Most earned their living through trade, craftsmanship, transport, or small-scale production. This diversity made Ottoman towns culturally rich, though social interaction remained shaped by religion, occupation, and neighborhood identity. Architecture varied greatly across the empire. Climate, geography, local materials, and regional traditions influenced how houses were built. Wealthy mansions stood near modest dwellings, revealing the sharp economic divisions within urban society. Many prosperous homes were hidden behind plain exterior walls and entered through decorative wooden doors. Privacy, rather than outward display, shaped much domestic architecture. Larger Muslim houses were commonly divided into two main sections. The selamlik was reserved for male guests, business, and public interaction. The haremlik served as the private family area and was generally closed to unrelated male visitors. This division did not mean that women were entirely isolated from social life. Instead, the household created separate spaces in which men and women entertained guests, maintained relationships, and performed their respective social roles. The homes of senior officials in the Balkans could be surrounded by vineyards, orchards, gardens, pools, fountains, and small pavilions. Many were constructed with stone lower floors, timber upper levels, and red tiled roofs. Running water was considered a mark of comfort and status. Poorer urban homes were simpler and often resembled village houses, though some possessed an additional upper floor or small courtyard. Despite the density and diversity of Ottoman cities, foreign visitors frequently commented on their apparent order. Janissary patrols and local watchmen helped maintain security. At night, streets became almost completely silent. Shops closed, movement declined, and watchmen announced their presence as they walked through the neighborhoods. Street lighting was limited or non-existent, and many roads were narrow, uneven, and poorly paved. Anyone traveling after dark was expected to carry a lantern or be accompanied by a servant holding one. Walking without light could be dangerous, not only because of crime but also because of open drains, animals, mud, and irregular ground. Travelers sometimes found Ottoman cities surprisingly quiet after sunset. Loud arguments, drunken shouting, and public disorder were considered unusual in many neighborhoods. Social life continued inside houses, coffee houses, private gardens, and religious institutions rather than openly in the streets. This produced an urban atmosphere that appeared calm on the surface, even though the city remained filled with commercial competition, political tension, communal rivalry, and constant human activity. The Ottoman city was therefore not simply a collection of buildings. It was a carefully layered social environment shaped by neighborhoods, faith, occupation, family, trade, and government. Provincial governors connected the regions to Istanbul, judges upheld the legal order, merchants linked distant markets, and neighborhood leaders organized everyday life. Together, these institutions allowed the empire to govern an extraordinarily diverse population across an immense territory. As Ottoman authority spread across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Arab provinces, conquest brought more than military control. It also transformed the physical and social character of towns. New rulers introduced Islamic institutions into urban life and reshaped conquered cities through the construction of mosques, schools, fountains, bathhouses, soup kitchens, palaces, bridges, and commercial buildings. These structures did not simply serve religious or practical purposes. They announced the presence of the Ottoman state and gave its cities a recognizable architectural identity. Ottoman sultans, ministers, governors, and wealthy officials became major patrons of construction. Their projects encouraged settlement, trade, education, and public welfare. Architecture was one of the clearest expressions of Ottoman power because it could be seen everywhere, from the imperial capital to provincial towns in the Balkans and the Middle East. A mosque complex, market, bridge, or public fountain could permanently alter the life of a neighborhood and demonstrate the wealth and organization of the government that built it. No architect represented this tradition more completely than Sinan, who served several 16th century sultans. During his long career, he designed mosques, schools, bridges, bathhouses, hospitals, tombs, and water systems across the empire. His early masterpiece, the Shehzade Mosque complex, was built in memory of one of Sultan Suleiman's sons. Its central dome and surrounding half-domes created a balanced interior that revealed Sinan's growing command of space, light, and structure. He later designed the Süleymaniye Mosque, one of Istanbul's most commanding monuments. Rising above the city and overlooking the harbor, the complex contained far more than a place of worship. Schools, charitable kitchens, medical facilities, and other public institutions surrounded the mosque, creating a center of religious, educational, and social life. Sinan's greatest personal achievement, however, was the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. Its vast central dome, slender minarets, balanced proportions, and carefully planned interior became one of the finest expressions of classical Ottoman architecture. Water played an equally important role in Ottoman urban planning. Public fountains were placed near mosques, streets, markets, and neighborhoods, supplying drinking water and allowing worshippers to wash before prayer. Aqueducts and distribution systems carried water over long distances, while bathhouses offered both cleanliness and social interaction. These projects required advanced engineering and large financial resources, making them visible demonstrations of government capacity. After conquering a city, Ottoman rulers generally sought to restore rather than abandon it. Walls and fortresses were repaired, damaged markets reopened, bathhouses reconstructed, and commercial facilities returned to use. New inhabitants were encouraged to settle, especially merchants, craftsmen, administrators, soldiers, and religious scholars. The goal was to transform a captured urban center into a functioning part of the imperial economy as quickly as possible. The reconstruction of Constantinople after 1453 was the most ambitious example of this policy. Years of warfare, economic decline, and population loss had left much of the city damaged or empty. Mehmed II understood that military conquest alone could not create a capital worthy of his empire. He invited people from many provinces to settle there and offered houses, gardens, and property to new arrivals. When voluntary migration proved insufficient, the government ordered families of different social and religious backgrounds to relocate to the city. Muslims, Christians, and Jews arrived from Anatolia, the Balkans, and other regions. They repaired houses, opened workshops, established religious institutions, and revived commercial life. Mosques, schools, charitable complexes, hospitals, and markets appeared throughout the city. Merchants and artisans brought skills and capital, while state officials created the administrative structure necessary to govern the new capital. Over time, Constantinople was transformed into Istanbul, the political and economic heart of the Ottoman world. Similar settlement policies were used elsewhere. Turkmen communities were moved from Anatolia into newly conquered Balkan regions, while Greek, Jewish, and Armenian merchants established businesses in expanding Ottoman towns. These migrations increased urban populations and created cities of remarkable linguistic, religious, and cultural variety. New Muslim communities often grew around garrisons, government offices, religious schools, and mosques, while older Christian and Jewish populations continued to play major roles in trade and craftsmanship. A provincial Ottoman city contained many officials responsible for keeping the state functioning. Judges heard legal cases, tax officers assessed revenue, soldiers guarded fortresses, market inspectors regulated prices and quality, customs officers supervised trade, engineers maintained public works, and architects directed construction. Religious scholars interpreted Islamic law and taught in schools. Together, these officials connected local life to the authority of the imperial government. Much of the empire's urban development was financed through charitable foundations known as vakufs. A person who created such a foundation permanently dedicated property or income to a religious or public purpose. Shops, farms, mills, inns, bathhouses, markets, or warehouses could generate revenue that paid for the operation of a mosque, school, hospital, fountain, bridge, kitchen, or Sufi lodge. The founder gave up direct ownership but gained social prestige and expected spiritual reward. The vakuf system allowed public institutions to function without depending entirely on annual payments from the central treasury. A mosque complex might be supported by rent from nearby shops, income from agricultural land, or fees collected from a bathhouse and caravanserai. Because the revenue source and charitable service were linked, a foundation could continue operating for generations. This system became one of the central engines of Ottoman urban growth. Charitable complexes often clustered around mosques and included schools, kitchens, hospitals, guest houses, and fountains. Commercial buildings were placed nearby, creating active districts that combined worship, education, welfare, and trade. Vakufs also financed bridges, ferries, roads, and water systems, making travel and commerce easier. Through these foundations, private wealth was converted into lasting public infrastructure. Beyond the palace and mosque, the marketplace formed the center of everyday urban life. Every important Ottoman city possessed a commercial district where goods were produced, stored, exchanged, and sold. Known as the Çarşı, this space brought together craftsmen, merchants, customers, porters, money changers, travelers, and officials. It was not merely an economic zone, but also a place where news circulated, relationships were formed, and different communities met. At the heart of many commercial districts stood the Bedesten, a secure covered building used for valuable merchandise. Its doors could be locked at night or during periods of unrest, protecting textiles, jewelry, precious metals, important documents, and other costly goods. Merchants sometimes stored their wealth in reinforced chambers within these buildings, giving the Bedesten a role similar to both a market and a secure commercial vault. Caravanserais and inns surrounded the commercial districts. They provided accommodation for merchants, storage for goods, and shelter for animals arriving with long-distance caravans. These facilities connected Ottoman cities to trade routes stretching across Europe, Asia, North Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Grain, textiles, spices, leather, metals, ceramics, weapons, timber, and luxury goods moved through these networks. The most famous Ottoman commercial complex was Istanbul's Covered Bazaar. Developed after the conquest, it expanded from a collection of shops into an enormous enclosed district. Its vaulted streets, narrow lanes, courtyards, fountains, warehouses, workshops, and gates formed something close to a city inside the city. As it grew, thousands of shops filled its interior, while mosques, bathhouses, schools, coffeehouses, and storage buildings served the people who worked and traded there. Different crafts occupied their own sections. Goldsmiths, shoemakers, carpet sellers, tailors, fur merchants, metalworkers, furniture makers, jewelers, cosmetic sellers, and dealers in second-hand clothing clustered together. This organization allowed customers to compare goods easily and enabled guilds to supervise quality, prices, training, and professional conduct. The arrangement also reduced some of the dangers associated with fire, noise, or unpleasant smells by keeping particular activities within designated areas. Merchants usually sat at the front of small, open shops, surrounded by their goods. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish traders often shared similar commercial habits and clothing, despite repeated attempts by some rulers to distinguish religious communities through dress. Everyday contact in the market encouraged cultural exchange and made economic cooperation essential, even in a society divided by faith and legal status. Outside the main covered bazaar, specialized markets served particular needs. Fish markets sold catches from the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, the Black Sea, and the Sea of Marmara. The Egyptian market became famous for spices, perfumes, herbs, medicines, dried foods, and unusual substances used in traditional remedies. Other districts specialized in animals, timber, grain, textiles, books, weapons, or second-hand goods. Although Ottoman marketplaces were often associated with male public life, women were also present. Poor women and villagers sold food, cloth, embroidery, and household products. Female peddlers carried goods into residential districts and visited women who rarely entered crowded markets. Wealthier women could own shops and commercial property, although male relatives or agents often managed daily transactions on their behalf. The Ottoman city therefore emerged from the interaction of architecture, religion, charity, government, and commerce. Mosques gave neighborhoods a religious center, fountains and baths supplied essential services, vakıfs financed public institutions, and markets connected local production to distant trade. Through rebuilding, migration, and investment, conquered towns were transformed into active imperial centers. Their monuments, crowded bazaars, mixed populations, and charitable complexes became some of the most enduring features of Ottoman civilization. Within the Ottoman social order, merchants and craftsmen occupied an important but clearly subordinate position beneath soldiers, administrators, and religious officials. Their clothing, public behavior, and place within ceremonial life reflected this distinction. In many cities, artisans and shopkeepers were organized through guilds, while the wealthiest merchants operated beyond the local economy and connected Ottoman markets with distant regions across Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Ottoman commerce included both small-scale local exchange and large international ventures. Local traders usually bought goods from craftsmen and resold them within the city or surrounding countryside. Since they operated inside the urban guild system, they were subject to regulations governing prices, quality, competition, and professional conduct. Long-distance merchants, known as tukar or bazirgan, worked on a much larger scale. They organized caravans, financed overseas shipments, imported luxury products, and distributed raw materials and finished goods across the empire. These merchants played a vital role in supplying cities. Grain, cotton, wool, leather, timber, spices, dyes, textiles, metals, perfumes, and valuable manufactured goods often passed through their hands before reaching consumers. Their commercial activities also generated customs duties and transport taxes for the government. Because they controlled valuable networks of credit, transport, and information, the most successful merchants could become highly influential even though they did not formally belong to the ruling class. Many senior officials and wealthy families invested in commercial ventures through partnerships managed by experienced merchants. Government service produced wealth, but opportunities for directly investing that money were limited. International trade therefore offered officials, governors, religious foundations, and urban notables a chance to increase their fortunes. A merchant might contribute his knowledge and labor, while a wealthy investor supplied the capital. Profits were then divided according to the agreement between them. The richest merchants often operated near secure covered markets where costly goods could be protected. They dealt in jewels, rare fabrics, spices, perfumes, dyes, slaves, and other products whose value was high in relation to their size. Their wealth was visible in the quality of their homes, clothing, possessions, and commercial connections. Yet their success also made them objects of suspicion. Merchants were frequently accused of taking advantage of shortages, manipulating supply, and buying goods cheaply in order to sell them at much higher prices. When food became scarce or prices rose, the public often blamed traders for hoarding grain or withholding essential goods. Their reputation suffered even more when wealthy merchants entered tax collection, an activity widely disliked because it placed private individuals between the government and ordinary taxpayers. From the late 16th century onward, several changes weakened the position of traditional Ottoman merchants. European shipping expanded its influence over Mediterranean commerce, while families connected to military and administrative households gained control of important tax revenues and urban resources. These developments allowed new elites to dominate both local politics and economic life. Craft production followed a different structure. Artisans, manufacturers, shopkeepers, and small traders belonged to professional associations generally known as guilds. Such organizations had existed in Constantinople before the Ottoman conquest, but they expanded rapidly as the city was rebuilt and repopulated. By the 17th century, Istanbul contained an extraordinary number of specialized trades, workshops, and professional groups. Guilds served several purposes at once. They regulated production, trained new craftsmen, limited unfair competition, and acted as intermediaries between workers and the government. They also performed social functions. A guild might help a member open a shop, support him during illness, pay burial expenses, assist his family after death, maintain guards, contribute to firefighting, or provide charity to the poor. The Ottoman government closely supervised guild activity. Officials sought to prevent uncontrolled price increases, excessive competition, and the production of poor quality goods. In cooperation with guild leaders, the state could determine how many shops operated within a particular trade and restrict the opening of new workshops. The purpose was not unlimited economic growth, but stability. Production was expected to meet the needs of the local population without allowing either craftsmen or merchants to exploit consumers. Prices and permitted profits were often regulated. Authorities inspected weights, measures, workmanship, and the quality of food and manufactured goods. The economic ideal was one of balance rather than aggressive expansion. Craftsmen were expected to earn a respectable living, but they were not supposed to become rich by creating artificial shortages or charging whatever the market could bear. Guilds also helped the state supervise crowded urban populations. Because the central police force was relatively small, the government relied on professional organizations to identify their members, collect taxes, maintain discipline, and report disorder. Guild leaders could be held responsible for misconduct within their trade, giving them a strong incentive to control the behavior of their colleagues. During military campaigns, craftsmen supplied the army with essential equipment. Tailors produced uniforms and coats, shoemakers made boots, leather workers prepared harnesses, and tent makers supplied shelters. Blacksmiths repaired weapons and tools, while bakers, butchers, and transport workers helped feed and move soldiers. Certain professions were directly recruited for naval service, particularly boatmen, rowers, dock workers, and sailors from Istanbul and nearby coastal communities. Urban production depended heavily on the countryside. Villages supplied wool, hides, cotton, grain, timber, and other raw materials required by city workshops. Yet direct exchange between villagers and craftsmen was not always common. Guilds, tax collectors, and merchants often stood between producers and manufacturers. Rural households also made many of their own basic goods and had little spare cash after paying taxes, limiting their ability to purchase urban products. The principal customers of many craftsmen were therefore government officials, soldiers, merchants, and other urban residents rather than peasants. Fine clothing, metalwork, furniture, jewelry, ceramics, weapons, and luxury goods were especially dependent on demand from the wealthy. Rural families might visit the city to buy special textiles or household objects for weddings and other ceremonies, but such purchases were occasional rather than part of everyday life. Membership in a guild was limited. When a craftsman died or retired, his position might pass to a son, apprentice, or buyer who acquired his tools and stock. This restricted entry protected existing members from excessive competition, but also made many trades difficult for outsiders to enter. Each guild possessed its own internal hierarchy, customs, symbols, and professional rules. Members generally advanced through three main stages: apprentice, journeyman, and master. An apprentice entered a workshop at the lowest level and learned through years of observation, repetition, and discipline. He was expected to obey both his master and more experienced journeymen. Training extended beyond practical skill. Apprentices were taught honesty, restraint, respect, generosity, and pride in workmanship. Religious and ethical instruction could take place in Sufi lodges or guild gatherings, where senior craftsmen explained the moral traditions of the profession. Each trade often recognized a spiritual patron whose example represented the values expected from its members. When an apprentice had demonstrated sufficient ability and good character, he could be promoted through a public ceremony. Receiving the craftsman's apron symbolized his acceptance into the profession. Such occasions might include prayers, poetry, music, food, and public entertainment, turning professional advancement into a community celebration. Guild leadership combined practical and spiritual authority. The Ketuda represented the craft before the government, collected taxes, negotiated official demands, and defended the interests of guild members. A separate religious leader or sheikh offered moral guidance and preserved the customs associated with the trade. Craftsmanship was understood as an honorable calling, rather than simply a means of accumulating money. Aggressive self-promotion, dishonest competition, and excessive profit-seeking could be treated as violations of professional ethics. A respected artisan gained prestige through the beauty, durability, and reliability of his work. Openly boasting about goods or attempting to steal customers from another craftsman was often regarded as shameful. Shops usually did not rely on large signs or elaborate advertising. Goods were displayed when requested, and customers generally knew which section of the market specialized in the object they wanted. Ottoman commercial districts were highly organized by profession. Shoemakers worked near other shoemakers, coppersmiths occupied their own street, and dealers in carpets, jewelry, clothing, leather, or furniture gathered in separate sections. This arrangement made comparison easy for customers while allowing guilds to monitor quality and conduct. It also gave each district a distinctive sound and appearance. A visitor could move from the ringing of metalworkers' hammers to the scent of leather shops, textile stalls, spice dealers, and food sellers within only a few streets. The Ottoman urban economy was therefore shaped by a constant tension between commerce and regulation. Long-distance merchants pursued opportunity and profit across vast trading networks, while guilds emphasized stability, professional honor, and local service. Together they supplied the cities, connected urban workshops to rural producers, supported the military, paid taxes, and helped sustain the everyday life of the empire. Ottoman economic life was regulated by a detailed system of professional rules, moral expectations, and government supervision. Guilds did not operate freely according to competition alone. Their conduct was shaped by older traditions associated with semi-religious brotherhoods, by professional certificates, and by orders issued from the palace. These rules governed prices, product quality, commercial honesty, public behavior, and the responsibilities of craftsmen toward both customers and fellow members of their trade. Prices were usually determined through negotiation between state officials and guild representatives. The government wanted to prevent merchants and craftsmen from exploiting consumers, while guildmasters sought to protect their members from sudden losses. Standards were also established for the quality, size, weight, and material of goods sold in the marketplace. This close supervision helped the state collect taxes more reliably and maintain order in crowded commercial districts. The official responsible for enforcing many of these regulations was the muhtasib, or market inspector. He and his assistants regularly moved through bazaars, workshops, and busy streets, inspecting scales, checking measurements, examining goods, and watching for dishonest transactions. False weights, poor quality materials, hidden defects, unpaid debts, and fraudulent sales all came under his authority. Some products, including cloth, timber, and building materials, could not legally be sold until they had been inspected and marked as meeting official standards. When wrongdoing was obvious, the muhtasib could impose an immediate punishment or bring the offender before the local judge. More complicated disputes involving contradictory testimony, formal evidence, or sworn statements were transferred to the qadi. Punishment was often public because shame was considered a powerful deterrent. A dishonest merchant might be paraded through the streets carrying the defective goods he had attempted to sell, making his offense visible to the entire community. The muhtasib also watched over public morality. He could act against open drunkenness, theft, disorderly conduct, or behavior considered improper in public spaces. His power, however, had limits. He could intervene only when an offense occurred openly and could not enter a private home simply to investigate personal behavior. Ottoman law recognized the household as a protected space, even while public life remained closely supervised. Another essential institution of the Ottoman city was the public bathhouse. A town without a mosque, marketplace, and hammam was often considered incomplete. Public baths supplied far more than cleanliness. They offered warmth, rest, conversation, grooming, and recreation, becoming some of the most important social spaces in urban life. Bathhouses appeared in nearly every major neighborhood. Some had separate sections for men and women, while others assigned different days or hours to each group. Their water was supplied by springs, rivers, wells, or aqueducts, and many were connected financially to mosques or charitable foundations. Ottoman builders also introduced hammams into Balkan towns, where they became lasting features of the urban landscape. A typical hammam contained three main areas. Visitors first entered a large reception hall where they changed clothes and stored their belongings. From there, they passed into a warmer chamber that helped the body adjust to the heat. The innermost section was filled with steam and contained heated stone platforms, washing basins, fountains, and smaller private spaces. Inside the bath, attendants scrubbed the skin, washed the hair, massaged the body, and sometimes provided shaving or grooming services. Bathers wore raised wooden sandals to protect their feet from the wet and heated floors. Among wealthy families, these sandals could be elaborately decorated and treated as luxury objects. After washing, visitors returned to the cooling room, where they rested on cushions and carpets, wrapped in towels and light robes. Sherbet, coffee, sweets, fruit, and other refreshments might be served. A visit could last for hours, especially among those who treated the hammam as a place of leisure rather than simply hygiene. For women, the public bath had particular social importance. Social custom limited their presence in many coffee houses and other public venues dominated by men, but the hammam provided a respected environment in which they could meet friends, exchange news, discuss family matters, arrange marriages, resolve disputes, or enjoy music and entertainment. Mothers could observe prospective brides, relatives could negotiate household alliances, and women could temporarily escape the repetitive labor of domestic life. Men also used the baths for conversation and social contact. Business relationships were strengthened there, news circulated, and disputes could be discussed informally. Unlike some other forms of male entertainment, gathering in a hammam carried no strong suggestion of improper conduct. Cleanliness and sociability existed side by side. Wealthy officials and families sometimes built private baths inside their residences and allowed relatives or dependents to use them. Even so, public hammams remained popular because most people could not afford such facilities. Their constant use made them important places where different social classes crossed paths, though distinctions of wealth remained visible in clothing, attendance, and personal accessories. Travel and commerce depended equally on another major Ottoman institution, the Han or caravanserai. Along highways, these buildings offered safety, food, water, shelter, and storage in regions where travelers faced bandits, harsh weather, or long distances between settlements. Inside cities, they served as warehouses, commercial centers, and temporary residences for merchants. Roadside caravanserais functioned as stopping points between stages of a journey, while urban Hans marked the end of a route. Traders arriving with caravans could stable their animals, unload merchandise, rent rooms, negotiate sales, and gather information before continuing onward. Pilgrims, craftsmen, wandering dervishes, couriers, soldiers, and merchants from distant lands all passed through these buildings. Most Hans followed a practical design. A large stone structure surrounded an open courtyard, often with a fountain in the center. Stables and warehouses occupied the ground floor, while sleeping rooms, offices, and storerooms opened onto galleries above. Some contained a small mosque, coffee house, kitchen, or counting room. Different Hans could specialize in particular groups or commodities. Silk merchants might gather in one building, tobacco dealers in another, while Persian, Arab, Armenian, Greek, Jewish, or Central Asian traders developed their own preferred meeting places. Less prosperous travelers and pilgrims stayed in simpler establishments, while the wealthiest merchants used Hans with secure storage and extensive commercial services. At night, the gates were closed and guarded. The keeper of the Han was responsible for everyone who entered and left, as well as for the valuable goods stored within the walls. Because merchants entrusted him with textiles, spices, weapons, precious metals, tobacco, and other costly merchandise, his reputation for honesty was essential. He also became a major source of local information, hearing news from travelers arriving from every direction. Beyond the cities, the peasant household formed the foundation of Ottoman society. Most of the empire's population lived in villages and depended on farming, herding, and household production. A typical rural family included a husband, wife, children, and sometimes married sons, grandchildren, or other relatives. The household was both a family and a unit of economic production. The father generally represented the family before the government. Tax registers recorded the household under his name, and he was expected to organize labor, manage land, and settle internal disputes. The family structure was strongly patriarchal, but its survival depended on cooperation between men, women, children, and extended relatives. Most cultivated land was legally considered state property. Peasants did not own fields in the modern sense, but they usually possessed hereditary rights to work them. These rights passed from father to son as long as the household continued cultivation and paid its obligations. Land could not normally be sold, divided, transferred, or abandoned without official approval. The government placed particular importance on grain production. Wheat and barley fed the population, supplied cities, and supported the army. For this reason, officials discouraged the conversion of fields into orchards or gardens when such changes threatened the grain supply. Agricultural policy aimed less at maximizing private profit than at maintaining subsistence, taxation, and social stability. A family holding was expected to be large enough to support one household. The state generally tried to preserve its unity rather than allow constant fragmentation among heirs. In regions where land was abundant but labor scarce, Keeping peasants attached to cultivation was considered essential. Abandoned fields meant lost revenue, reduced food production, and weaker military finances. Peasant households paid taxes in both goods and money. A share of the harvest went to the Sipahi, who held local revenue rights in return for cavalry service. Grain collected in kind formed an important part of his income. Families also paid regular dues linked to the size and legal status of their holdings. A peasant was not free to leave his field whenever he wished. If he abandoned the land, the local Sipahi could seek an order requiring his return. The government feared rural flight because it reduced cultivation and tax income. A villager who settled permanently in a town might instead be required to pay compensation to the former revenue holder. Village houses were normally grouped close together rather than scattered across separate farms. Compact settlement provided security against raiders, bandits, armies, and political disorder. Families walked to their fields each morning and returned to the village in the evening. Neighbors worked together during construction, harvests, repairs, and emergencies. Building materials varied widely across the empire. In dry regions of Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, timber was limited, so villagers relied heavily on mud brick. Earth and straw were shaped in wooden molds, dried in the sun, and used to construct thick walls that kept interiors relatively cool during summer. Mud brick was cheap and widely available, but it performed poorly during earthquakes and heavy rain. Flat roofs were built with wooden poles, reeds, straw, mud, and clay, then stamped or rolled into a firm surface. These roofs had to be repaired regularly, especially after winter storms. Rural homes contained little movable furniture. Platforms, shelves, seating areas, and storage spaces were often built directly into the walls. Rugs and woven mats covered the floor where families could sit, eat, and sleep. Bedding was unfolded at night and stored during the day, a custom also found among wealthier urban households. Heating came from wall fireplaces or metal braziers filled with hot coals. Shutters, curtains, textiles, and animal skins reduced cold drafts. But warm clothing remained the main protection against winter. Meals were simple and based on bread, yogurt, cheese, grain, vegetables, and whatever animal products the family could afford. In wetter regions such as the Balkans and the Black Sea coast, timber and stone were more common. Houses often had sloping roofs covered with tiles or wooden shingles. Some Balkan homes had stone lower floors and timber upper stories, with animals or storage below and living quarters above. Egyptian village houses reflected different environmental conditions. Roofs were made from palm trunks, branches, millet stalks, mud, and straw. Some homes included large ovens that also served as heated sleeping platforms during winter. Furniture remained limited to mats, pottery, grinding stones, and basic household tools. House construction involved the entire community. Men commonly shaped bricks, raised walls, and built roofs, while women produced rugs, bedding, sacks, curtains, and other textiles essential to domestic life. Skilled villagers who knew how to construct roofs, ovens, wells, or stone walls were especially valued. Villages were often built away from major roads to reduce exposure to armies, tax collectors, bandits, and rebels. War, disease, environmental change, and economic insecurity could force entire communities to relocate. During periods of weak government, some villages were abandoned as residents sought safety in towns or more stable regions. The center of village life usually contained a mosque or church, a coffee house or tea house, a small shop, and perhaps a fountain. There were few permanent government buildings. The main link between the community and the state was the village headman, a respected farmer or herder who represented local interests, transmitted orders, and helped organize taxation. Family connections shaped nearly every aspect of rural life. Parents, children, cousins, uncles, aunts, and in-laws often lived in the same village and depended on one another during planting, harvest, illness, marriage, and construction. Marriage within extended kin networks strengthened these bonds and kept land, labor, and property within the community. Men gathered in coffee houses or private homes to discuss crops, taxes, war, prices, and local news. Women met in one another's houses, shared domestic work, exchanged information, and cared for children collectively. Villagers traveled to nearby market towns to sell surplus produce and purchase tools, cloth, animals, jewelry, salt, metal goods, and other items unavailable locally. Traditional agriculture relied on simple but durable methods. Wooden plows drawn by oxen or buffalo cultivated wheat, barley, oats, millet, rye, and other crops. Gardens near rivers and village edges produced fruit and vegetables. Losing a pair of oxen could ruin a household because the animals served as the primary source of agricultural power. Labor was divided by gender and age. Men usually handled plowing, sowing, harvesting, construction, travel to markets, and dealings with officials. Women cooked, raised children, cared for animals, processed food, managed household supplies, and helped with many agricultural tasks. Neither side could easily sustain the family without the other. Children entered this labor system early. Boys first watched sheep or goats, then assisted with sowing and harvesting before taking on heavier work. Girls learned cooking, sewing, childcare, cleaning, animal care, and textile production from their mothers and older female relatives. Education was therefore practical and closely connected to future household responsibilities. Formal schooling remained limited in most villages. Where schools existed, they usually admitted boys and concentrated on prayer, memorization, and basic religious instruction. Only a small number of especially talented children continued their education in a nearby town. Most boys learned farming directly from their fathers, brothers, and uncles. Girls were educated almost entirely within the household. They were taught domestic skills, modest behavior, respect for elders, and the expectations associated with marriage and motherhood. Family honor placed especially heavy restrictions on female sexuality, and violations could bring severe social punishment. Religion tied rural communities together and gave meaning to the cycle of birth, marriage, work, illness, and death. Muslim villages followed the mosque, imam, and local religious customs, while Christian peasants relied on the church, priest, and calendar of saints. Because most villagers could not read sacred texts, religious life blended formal teaching with local tradition, inherited rituals, and popular belief. Among Christian peasants in the Balkans, Sundays and saints' days provided relief from ordinary labor. Families wore their best clothing, attended church, prepared simple meals, visited neighbors, and gathered for music and dancing. These occasions strengthened community identity and brought young people together in a socially accepted setting. Nearby market towns connected villages to the wider Ottoman world. There peasants encountered judges, soldiers, tax officials, merchants, craftsmen, religious schools, bathhouses, mills, warehouses, bakeries, coffee houses, and government offices. A villager could sell produce in the morning, purchase necessities, visit a shrine or bath, and return home before nightfall. Ottoman rural life was demanding, physically exhausting, and vulnerable to taxation, war, disease, drought, and crop failure. Yet it was also sustained by close family ties, communal cooperation, religious tradition, and a deep attachment to the land. The village household produced the food, labor, and revenue upon which the cities, armies, and institutions of the empire ultimately depended.